sport. Electricity is a team sport.
It's very important that we work together to solve the region's problems collectively.
We really need to come together like CapEx 2020 did.
We need to work closely with our policymakers, our regulators, our local governments, and other stakeholders.
The important thing is to have a really robust discussion about the issues that we're facing in transmission. And I think that's what's going to occur today.
Grid North Partners welcomes you to Finding True North, a regional dialogue about delivering tomorrow's energy. We're building on the momentum, the trust, and collaboration that has made us a success since we formed in 2004 as CapEx 2020. Our 10 utilities completed 800 miles of high-voltage transmission lines in the upper Midwest. These lines now deliver reliable, safe, and affordable energy while creating new pathways for renewable energy. We achieved the vision we had nearly 2 decades ago in partnership with each other and with you. And now, the journey continues. We're making tomorrow's energy possible together.
It's very important for us to understand the dynamic nature of weather-based generation and the need to both have backup generation and the ability to connect all of that generation so that we can safely serve our customers. Together we can do that, but we must be together so that we can accomplish that.
We're expanding our proportion of renewable energy while also reducing carbon emissions and delivering on our commitment of keeping the system both reliable and our customer bills affordable. And the transmission system is absolutely key to this evolution.
One thing that concerns me about our grid is that we're not going to be ready in a timely manner. And so in order to be able to electrify our economy, we need a robust and reliable transmission grid.
We are all disparate utilities with our own goals and our own objectives, but there is an issue that we have in common, and that is the transmission build-out throughout the region. It's very important that we work together to solve the region's problems collectively.
We need to work closely with our policymakers, our regulators, our local governments, and other stakeholders to ensure that we move forward on the right path with the right plan.
The issues facing transmission are increasingly regional or even interregional in nature, and how we resolve them is going to focus on looking beyond just the issues that come up in individual transmission owner footprints. So the broader perspective is helpful in terms of trying to have a dialogue about getting solutions to the challenges that are facing transmission these days.
Just remember, you're all doing very important work, and I've always believed that the best ideas come from collaboration, not contemplation. So roll up your sleeves, be open to others' ideas, because collectively we will come up with solutions for the issues we face in common, much better than those we can come up with on our own.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's dialogue on what the Upper Midwest needs to focus on as we transition to a new energy future. My name is Priti Patel, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Transmission Officer for Great River Energy. We're an electric generation and transmission cooperative and a founding member of Grid North Partners. And on behalf of the Grid North Partners, we appreciate all of you taking the time today to be a part of this important discussion as our industry continues on its journey of transformation. So many of you today represent the interests of the Upper Midwest. You are legislators, policymakers, community leaders, regulators, change makers in the electric industry, and there are some of you just interested in better understanding the road ahead as the electric industry transforms. We hope today's dialogue is informative. By way of background, for those of you that are new to us, Grid North Partners is a voluntary partnership of 10 utilities that came together around 2 decades ago under the name CapEx 2020. We came together because there were serious challenges that were facing us. The need to build for wind, the need to build for reliability. We needed to build a high voltage backbone of transmission in the Upper Midwest. And together we did that. We planned, we designed, and we built the transmission to meet our 2020 goals. We are Central Municipal Power Agency Services, Dairyland Power Cooperative, Great River Energy, Minnesota Power, Missouri River Energy Services, Otter Tail Power Company, Rochester Public Utilities, Southern Minnesota Municipal Power Agency, WPPI Energy, and Xcel Energy. We have a unique partnership, one of the first in the nation. It's unique given the diversity of our business models. We're a mix of cooperatives, agencies, municipals, and investor-owned utilities. And as transmission owners and operators, we're guided by an important common bond that we all share. And that is that we have an obligation to operate and maintain a safe, affordable, and reliable system for our customers and our members. And we take pride in that. And despite each of us having different policy goals and business objectives, we have a proven track record of being able to come together to meet the challenges of an evolving electric industry and advance transmission plans for the greater good of the Midwest. Michael Lamb, Senior Vice President of Transmission for Xcel Energy, is going to talk more about Grid North Partners and who we are as an organization. But before he does that, I want to make just a few brief comments about why we're here today and what is behind the theme that we chose for our dialogue today. Finding True North. So one definition of True North is an orienting point in a spinning world that helps you stay on track. So consider our industry right now. It's changing at a speed and magnitude that is unprecedented. Minnesota has a state goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2025, 80% by 2050. Wisconsin has a goal of 100% carbon-free generation by 2050. Recently, we read Governor Burgum of North Dakota articulated a goal of carbon neutrality by 2030. Illinois has a goal of 100% carbon neutrality by 2050. We're seeing generation portfolios evolve, diversify, and become more and more weather dependent. And this is happening not only in the upper Midwest, but everywhere. The pace by which many companies are committing to decarbonize is increasing, and for some, they want to speed that pace up even more. And at the same time, we're seeing increased projections of electrification, especially in the transportation sector. We're seeing current forecasts show the number of electric vehicles will increase 15-fold in the next decade. Not only will we need to ensure reliability to keep the lights on, but going forward, the grid will be required to get people from point A to point B. And with these supply and demand changes, we will see load patterns become more sporadic and different from what we've experienced in the past. How will we connect all the dispersed generation of the future without drawing the ire of landowners? Are microgrids in some parts of the upper Midwest actually something we should consider more meaningfully? Are we planning for the right amount of resources at the times we may need them the most during the year? We're seeing communities face the loss of jobs as our plants retire, wondering what their futures will hold. And how do we include the many voices of our historically underrepresented communities into this new energy future? And while all of this is underway, we've also watched our country experience extreme events that have left millions without power for days at a time, whether it was due to extreme heat, extreme cold, or storms. And for many up here, it makes us ask ourselves, what could happen here, and are we ready? We know that everything we do and every decision we make needs to lead us to the most important attribute of electricity, and that's reliability. Making sure we can serve our customers 24/7. That's our North Star. That's our true north. So today's discussion is a regional dialogue about what we need to think about here in the upper Midwest. We have our own unique challenges that we need to understand better. We have incredibly strong potential and opportunity for so many energy resources in our region. Renewables are expected to double in the next 10 years in the upper Midwest, while on the other hand, 50% of our conventional generation resources will retire in the next 10 years. And both of these trends are accelerating. So today you will hear from people who have deep knowledge and experience and expertise in the upper Midwest. The more we understand from these different and important voices, the better we can transition while we keep reliability and affordability at the very center. In the past, the number of people and stakeholders who had to be involved in developing and planning transmission was smaller. Collaboration and working together was more of a nice to have. Today, it's an absolute must. Today, making sure that we have a reliable, resilient transmission grid means working together on a state level, on an interstate level, on an interregional level, and on a national level. And we need to clearly understand the impacts to our local communities. That's why we're all here today. Now I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes to my friend and colleague, Michael Lamb, Senior Vice President of Transmission for Xcel Energy.
Thank you, Pretty. As Pretty said, I'm Michael Lamb, Senior Vice President of Transmission at Xcel Energy. We're an investor-owned utility serving 3 million customers in 8 states around the country, including 1.5 million customers right here in the upper Midwest. We are also proud, very proud, to be a co-founding member of Grid North Partners, which is, as Pretty mentioned, an evolution of CapEx 2020. Pretty talked about what we are seeing for the pace of change in our region today. Daunting, overwhelming, but exciting all at the same time. Nearly 20 years ago, the upper Midwest saw a similar opportunity. Renewable energy was proving to be a great resource for our company, and we began taking advantage of this great resource for our customers. And our company, like many of our partners, if not all of them, has seen that transformation continue. Where we used to almost exclusively generate electricity with coal, nuclear, and natural gas, we now are pursuing our plan to reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2030, and more ambitiously, pursuing our vision of delivering 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. I'm proud to be part of a company, Xcel Energy, that was the first to announce such a carbon-free vision way back in December of 2018. In fact, we're moving quickly on that plan, and as of last year, we have reduced emissions by 54% since 2005. This change has been driven by a combination of public policy and many state goals, our own company priorities and regional priorities, economics, and low-cost renewables in the upper Midwest, and probably most importantly, the desire to meet the desire of our customers who have told us they want sustainable energy at an affordable price, and as Pretty mentioned, with high levels of reliability that all of the Grid North partners deliver. The pace and magnitude of change we saw on the horizon in 2004 was huge, and we realized that we could come together as partners to upgrade and expand the transmission grid. We knew it was a heavy lift, but it was absolutely needed for our region, our economy, and our customers. The result is the successful development of 800 miles of new backbone high voltage transmission that came into service in 2017. It strengthened our region's grid and has created new pathways for renewable energy. And of course, what we are seeing for change today is considerably bigger. I think that point requires some emphasis. The change we saw in 2004 was huge, and the change we see now is tremendously bigger. So our group of utilities, the Grid North partners, working together for nearly 2 decades now as innovative partners and a leading authority in transmission planning and execution, all to ensure we provide reliable, clean, and affordable electricity to our communities and our customers. As I said, we successfully built more than 800 miles of high voltage transmission line in the upper Midwest, which was, at the time, the largest transmission expansion in the region in over 40 years. Well, this previous build out was successful and got us to our target, the namesake year 2020. We know further action is needed to manage the new challenges and opportunities we're facing. We know further action is needed to meet our new goals and objectives. So we are moving forward under our new name, Grid North Partners. Our organizations, both large and small, are collaborating on what is needed to meet the challenges of the energy landscape in our region now and for the future. Last year, before we announced our new name, we released the CapEx 2050 Transmission Vision Report. The goal of that report was to educate and inform upper Midwest policymakers and other stakeholders of the implications of a future that is more reliant on non-dispatchable resources. The challenges identified in the report help promote understanding and help stakeholders identify and implement solutions that enable the generation fleet to transition to a reduced carbon future. The report is available on our website, and I won't get into the findings now, but rather I will fast forward to say that this was just the start. Indeed, this was just the start. As Grid North partners, we are committed to taking action. We need to build on our previous successes. This means jointly analyzing and developing solutions which cost effectively maintain reliability while providing clean energy to our customers. We need to explore new technology. We know that new technologies may be able to bolster our transmission system while minimizing impact and improving resiliency. We are committed to minimizing impact when we can. We all live in the communities we serve, and we want to maximize the benefits and minimize any negative impacts to those communities and our customers. We need to engage and collaborate. In 2004, we were engaging across a 5-state area, and at the time, that was not only sufficient, it was world-class. That is no longer the case. We need to broaden those efforts. We are not only collaborating with MISO, we are even now looking beyond to collaborating with SPP. Because at the end of the day, we want what is best for our customers and members. We are making tomorrow's energy possible together. Now, I will turn it back over to Priti to lead us into the agenda.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to share with all of you a short message from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He's not with us here today, but his message of encouragement and support for our discussion here today is critically important. Governor Walz is the chair of the Midwest Governors Association and is an advocate for collaborative planning when it comes to transmission investments that support the transformation that the electric industry is going through.
Hello, everyone. Governor Tim Walz here. As governor, I'm grateful for the strong partnership of the Grid North utilities. Together, you ensure that our lights stay on, our power remains reliable and affordable. As we look toward the future, I'm excited about the energy future of our state, particularly the possibilities of clean energy. Not only is clean energy the right and responsible choice for future generations, clean energy maximizes job creation and grows our economy. But we know that in order to do this, we're going to need to upgrade and expand our transmission infrastructure, and that's going to require smart planning and collaboration. That's why I've worked with other governors, including Governor Reynolds of Iowa, to encourage MISO to engage in the planning process around the long-term transmission needs of the entire region. Grid North Partnerships is a great example of the types of partnerships we need to ensure that we're making smart investments in order to have transmission system ready for our future energy systems. Here in the upper Midwest, we have the ingenuity and innovation needed to power this future, and we're ready to pioneer the green energy economy. Thank you.
Thank you to Governor Walz for that message. I also want to acknowledge and thank everyone who participated in our opening video message. These are important voices because when we say we're making tomorrow's energy possible together, we don't just mean us together as utilities, but all of us. And that includes policymakers, regulators, environmental organizations, property owners, the public, all of us. So today we have a great lineup of speakers and panelists. As you see them on the screen today, you can learn more about them by clicking on their professional bio. We'll start with a keynote presentation by Aaron Bloom, who is a board member of the Energy Systems and Integration Group. Then we'll move into 3 panel discussions. The first is called Policy and the Next Regional Buildout, and it will be moderated by Katie Sieben, who is the chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. The next is called Operating the Future System, and it'll be moderated by Joanne Thompson, who is Vice President of Asset Management for Otter Tail Power Company. And the final discussion is called Planning the Grid for Resiliency, and it will be moderated by Mark Mitchell, Chief Operating Officer for Southern Minnesota Municipal Power Agency. So one final note, this conference is meant to be a dialogue. We've tried to capture unique and interesting perspectives with the topics and panelists that we've selected, but we want to hear from all of you as well. So please, if you have a question you want to pose to our panels, use the Q&A feature. Now I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Aaron Bloom. Aaron is the Director of Energy Management, Research and Development at NextEra Analytics and the chair of the System Planning Working Group for ESIG. I may be hard-pressed to say whether we could have found anyone more passionate and curious about our energy future than Aaron. Aaron is known for his incredible commitment and interest around developing and operating the next generation energy grid. He's going to talk about planning for 100% clean energy and what it would take from a transmission perspective to reach the ambitious clean energy and decarbonization plans that are adopted by the Biden administration. Thank you for joining us today, Aaron, and the stage is yours.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today. And I want to start off by asking everybody a question. What was the grid like when you started your career in energy? Do you remember your first work assignment? Was it about reliability, economics, public policy, all three? Maybe it was about the CU power line or a coal plant that converted to run on natural gas. Let's go ahead and move to slide 3. Mine started in 2004 at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission with the California market redesign. Enron had just melted down the Western markets, and natural gas prices were on their way to setting a new peak. FERC Order 2000 was being treated like Voldemort, the order that should not be named. Wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries, well, they weren't what they are today. A lot has changed in the last 15 years. The idea of keeping a coal plant around seems as crazy today as wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries did in 2004. One thing that hasn't changed is the role of power systems planners. Of course, the computers are faster and generators are different and there's new regulations, but we're still planning for a system that takes decades to transform. And planners are still expected to create a system that will work for regulators and system operators. Most power systems plans or integrated resource plans look out over the next 10 to 15 years. But as we start looking towards 100% clean electricity, organizations are starting to plan for systems that might not get built until the planners themselves retire. Here's an example from a study I was leading at NREL before I joined NextEra. It's the City of Los Angeles' 100% renewable energy study. You can see from the dotted line that the IRP went from 2017 to 2035, but their plan for 100% required them to expand their horizon to consider what the system could look like in 2045. Plans for reaching 100% clean electricity are tedious. They have to be. We're dealing with large capital expenditures, massive machines, and a complex network that needs to be planned in excruciating detail. None of this means 100% clean electricity isn't possible, and it doesn't mean we have to take our sweet time. We can reach 100%, and we can get there fast, but we shouldn't try to reach these goals without deep consideration of the details. Because if we mess up, the operators won't have the tools they need to make it all work. I don't know about the rest of you, but I hope to retire sometime after 2040. And if we find our North Star, we'll chart a course for a future that is electrified, decarbonized, and more reliable than ever before. As Pretty said, my name is Aaron Bloom, and I'm passionate about electricity. Sometimes I write about it. Here's an article I recently wrote for the Institutional Investor. You might have also seen some of my research from NREL or have a plant that was designed using software from my company, NextEra Analytics. I'm a total energy geek. When I'm not being a father, husband, and employee, I'm volunteering my time with the Energy Systems Integration Group. I joined this troop of power systems nerds shortly after I started my career and won't be leaving this educational nonprofit anytime soon. ESIG allows me to engage with some of the sharpest minds in power systems, people like you, and it's a resource for members looking to navigate the evolving energy landscape. Today, I'm here to talk about a recent publication, Transmission Planning for 100% Clean Electricity. When I complete this talk, you should know 3 things. 1, what the leading research in power systems says about 100% clean electricity. 2, what role transmission should play in reaching that future. And 3, where you can go to engage, discuss, and create a plan for the clean energy economy. Let's get into it. The path to 100% clean electricity is a steep, winding trail to the top of a mountain. From where we stand today, it's like looking up to Mount Everest from base camp. We've come a long way, but the aggressive timeline spurred by the urgency of climate change means we need to tighten our boots and start hiking. We've got roughly 100 gigawatts of generating capacity today that's from clean electricity, particularly renewables, and we need to get to 1 terawatt of capacity to reach these goals. As researchers explore the challenge of reaching 100% clean electricity, they've identified 2 classes of problems. The first one is the balancing problem, and that's been studied quite extensively. It tries to understand how you balance supply and demand at the seconds, hours, and annual timescales, given the variability of weather, load, and all the other things that planners consider. The other challenge can be classified as the inverter challenge. And this one is unique to the introduction of large amounts of renewable energy, particularly from wind, solar, and batteries. This has to deal with how operators retain system stability when inverter-based resources lack the traditional inertia and ability to inject large amounts of current. If you want to dig into this more, I can't recommend enough the work by Paul Denholm that's really charted these out in a recent article in Joule, and you can find the link down below. So let's talk about the balancing challenge a little bit. There's really 3 time scales that we worry about. The first is short-term variability, and this one's largely been solved through market mechanisms, new technology, and new operating protocols. It's been relatively convenient that a lot of the baseload generation that we had that was relatively inflexible historically has had natural gas come into play and offers a lot of ramping capability to manage these moment-to-moment variations. The next challenge that we anticipate, particularly with large amounts of solar, is the diurnal mismatch problem. This is caused by sunrise and sunset and the daily pattern of people going to school, work, and in their home. This challenge is partially solved with a lot of great technologies on the horizon and some of them being built today, but there's still probably some additional research that needs to be done. The last problem, the one that's still quite far out from where we are today, is the seasonal problem caused by interannual variability in load and demand and supply. This is a challenge that we're starting to understand better. People are starting to do their simulations with significantly more years of weather analysis. But as we see an evolving climate, we need to consider more than what is in the historical record for weather. So the balancing challenge is one that's on the horizon, really well understood from a research perspective, but there's still a little bit of work to do. Let's go to the next slide. Here are 2 examples of the balancing problem that have been explored in the literature. On the left, we have ERCOT in a future where it has 92% clean electricity. On the right, we've got California with 94% electricity. You can see in the blue, those are areas of shortfall where you don't have enough wind or solar generation, where diurnal storage would be most valuable during these large periods on the left for ERCOT. Over on the right, you can see diurnal storage opportunities where you have these daily cycles where batteries and other technologies will be incredibly helpful to managing it. So how we balance those 2 challenges are the ones that we need to be looking forward to over the horizon. While there's been a lot of attention on extreme events, and it's something that we need to be considering, kind of the boring, plain vanilla events, those are ones that we need to be really focused on in the near term and making sure that we have solutions that solve those problems as well. Let's go talk about the inverter challenge now. So the rotational inertia from traditional generators assists in slowing the frequency decline after we have a disturbance on the grid. Most of you that went to power systems school all understand this, right? It's a natural phenomena that happens as a result of a rotating mass. But wind and solar, well, they don't rely on those traditional synchronous rotating machines. They rely on inverters, and as such, do not provide inertia. Now, that doesn't mean we should go screaming and run for cover because the whole system's going to collapse. There's also all sorts of new technology that's built inside these inverters that can allow them to respond more precisely to directions and not as an after effect of the rotational mass of the machines. So the inertial challenge is an emerging area of research. Again, there's another great paper by Paul Denholm referenced down here, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the amazing work of Deepak Rajmapamorian from EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. He's done some wonderful foundational work trying to understand the role of what are called grid forming inverters, and that'll take us to our next slide. So there's a lot of options that are out there for managing this inverter-based challenge, right? What we call IBRs, inverter-based resources. We generally think of them as grid-forming inverters, but actually when you get into the details, there's all sorts of options. And here's about 5 of them that can provide some control systems that help us keep the system going after a disturbance. In addition to these inverter technologies, of course, there's synchronous condensers, which have been around for decades and are a great way to help strengthen weak grid issues. So we have a lot of options that we could use to try to manage this challenge. They're out there on the horizon and we need to keep exploring them, but they shouldn't slow us down from reaching our goal. One of the other topics that I expect we'll find, especially as we look at the work that's been done by the MISO, is that transmission can be critical to making sure that these stability problems are managed appropriately. Next slide. So the conclusions from transmission research in this area really fall into 3 areas. 1, clean electricity generation must grow by an order of magnitude to reach 100% clean electricity. We've got 100% wind or 100 gigawatts of wind and solar on the grid today. We need to get to roughly 1,000 gigawatts in order to decarbonize large portions of the electricity system. The next major finding is that transmission is critical to smoothing variability at all timescales. And a network of cross-country transmission minimizes costs and maximizes flexibility for reaching these goals. Now, there's been a lot of research on power systems transformation. Some of them are quite good, and some of them are unique. We met at ESIG over the course of 6 weeks and made a series of recommendations on what it could take to decarbonize the economy. Some of those ideas even made it into President Biden's infrastructure plan. Let's take a look at each one of these in order. Here's a table that describes 6 studies that evaluated very high levels of clean electricity. They concluded that the United States will need at least 1 terawatt of wind and solar generation to decarbonize electricity demand, and considerably more if we want to decarbonize the energy economy. Of course, low growth assumptions are a major driver of changes in the generation mix, and direct comparisons across the studies are really difficult, right? Because they use different models, different vintages of data, and all sorts of other assumptions. But we do see some similarities, and we tried to highlight them here. When we dig into the numbers, we conclude that required growth of renewables is staggering. All the research seems to agree that the economics of wind and solar will make them the leading source of clean electricity, even when hydrogen, offshore wind, new age nuclear, and low-cost distributed generation are considered. The answer isn't really going to be one resource or the other. The answer is going to be all of the above. We're going to need generation at all scales and of all technologies to reach our goals. The research is also quite clear that the transmission costs are minimal when compared to the cost of building all the generation needed to reach this future. Different models, different data, different researches, the same conclusions. The benefits of transmission far outweigh the costs. Next one. So let's go ahead and review some of this research. The interconnection seam study, which is one that I'm rather fond of, looked at the benefits of joining together the Eastern and Western interconnection under a variety of different futures. It looked at replacing the existing back-to-back ties with a variety of HVDC options. One of them was relatively simple. You just expand the existing back-to-back ties. Another one looked at building 3 parallel ties that cross from strong parts in the West to strong parts in the Eastern interconnection, and then had large build-outs of the underlying AC system to deliver that generation to load. The final scenario looked at building an HVDC overlay, something that was designed by Dale Osborne, one of the legends, I would say, of the upper Midwest in terms of transmission planning. And we looked at scenarios that had between 50% and 85% renewables or 95% clean electricity. And what we found in those cases is that the benefits of transmission were massive. Sometimes we had a benefit to cost ratio of over 3. So that means that you could pay for that system 3 times over just because of the savings in fuel costs and other balancing costs. Really remarkable what we were able to show there. Let's go to the next study. The 0 by 50 study by Vibrant Clean Energy, which is expected to come out any day now, looked at the pathway to getting from where we are today to a future of 100% clean energy, where we've decarbonized the entire energy economy. And on that way, they actually looked at 100% clean electricity. And one of the things they showed is not only the benefit of building large-scale transmission, but also the symbiotic relationship between transmission, distributed energy resources, and utility-scale resources. This isn't a big or small question. This is all of the resources that need to be built to reach these common goals, because they're really quite ambitious. As we reach 100% clean energy, which is a massive, massive goal, the 0 by 50 study shows that if the macro grid is not built, it costs an additional $1 trillion to get to 100% clean energy by 2050. Clearly, the value of transmission keeps stacking up. Let's go talk about another study. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, recently did a paper in Joule that explored the benefits of transmission for joining together all 3 interconnections. And again, they found substantial value when you look at joining the systems. The least cost plan results in nearly doubling today's transmission system from both an HVDC and an AC level. So we're going to need multiple technologies to realize this goal. And one of the things they found is that if every state tries to reach their 100% clean electricity goals by themselves, that approach is going to be significantly more expensive than if we work together. We've got one more that I want to talk about, and that one's got 2 slides. Everybody in the upper Midwest has probably heard about the work that's been done by MISO on RIA, the Renewable Integration Impact Analysis. And it really set the bar for comprehensive power systems analysis for looking at ultra-high levels of renewables. As most of you know, the work really focused on that 40 to 60% problem, right? Trying to understand the balancing and the system steady state stability and dynamic stability challenges. But they also started to explore the 100% clean electricity challenges as well. And so I really think they set a model for what is possible. In particular, they highlighted the fact that while the economic studies, which look at the balancing problem, showed time and time again that transmission is an economic option for solving all of the different various challenges that are presented to the system. When they went to go look at the steady state and dynamic stability, they found all sorts of additional value streams to transmission that weren't quantified in the economic models alone. Let's go to the next slide and dig in a little bit more. What they found is that transmission is essential for dynamic and steady state stability. HVDC to mitigate weak grid issues, particularly in the upper Midwest, is critical to managing transient voltage and small signal stability issues. Synchronous condensers were simulated to mitigate reduced inertia and frequency response issues. And they found the transmission infrastructure is the biggest investment needed to make the 50% wind and PV case work. So if you haven't had a chance to see Jordan Bakke and the rest of his team talk about this fantastic work, I highly encourage you to follow the link and reach out to them to get into all the details. Another area that we also hear people talk about are storage and DERs. Storage and transmission work better together. This isn't a mutually exclusive decision. RIA indicates that storage-only solutions are more expensive and don't address all the issues. Distributed energy resources, DERs as we call them, are part of the solution as well, but they can't meet all the demand all the time. So we need to bring them together so that they have an opportunity to sell to broader markets. DERs reduce utility peak demand by about 16%, according to some work from Vibrant Clean Energy, and they can help smooth demand, which is incredibly valuable, particularly in load pockets. Transmission makes it all work better. Next one. The final topic that I want to talk about in this area is land availability. When you look at all those resource maps and you think about how much solar potential or wind potential there is in the United States, you're like, boy, we could be throwing up wind turbines and solar panels practically everywhere. But you need to start considering the underlying land use. And we've seen this time and time again. So you see these three different maps here that came from Anthony Lopez and True Mai out of NREL. Really sensational work that they've done. And I encourage you to go take a look at it. And you see how the wind resource potential decreases as you add geospatial constraints based on setback rules, other conflicts with land ownership or national lands like national parks and other things, and how that can reduce your available resources. And the end conclusion from this work, in my opinion, is you need to build where you can and connect it with markets, software, and wires to minimize the costs to serving electricity demand. And this is why it's so important. The lower the cost of electricity, the better opportunities for economic growth, because it's a fundamental input into how we run the rest of our economy. So let's talk about a coordinated multi-regional approach to reaching 100%. Something that we think is essential to reaching these goals. If you want to go to the moon, you're probably going to need a space program. If you want to decarbonize the economy, you're going to need a transmission plan. As we look out to the challenge that's ahead, we can see that there really isn't a coordinated vision across the whole country. And this is why I'm so excited to be here with Grid North, because I think they're setting the bar and the expectations for how we should be planning the system. And if we look at huge storms like this, ones that can cover large parts of our continent, we realize that regional planning alone probably isn't set up for a future where we have to deal with both the load and the supply changing at the same time. And when we look at our historical record and we know that climate change is going to make the future different than the past, we really need to be thinking about more robust solutions. The weather is boundless. It doesn't care about RTO boundaries, resource adequacy constructs, or whether or not your system is prepared. Weather does what weather do. And the only way to manage drought, famine, and extreme weather is to look to your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor. There isn't a state in the country that closes its border to crops from another state during a drought. Extreme weather happens. It's very hard to predict, and despite best laid plans, extreme weather can do things you've never seen before. A National Transmission Planning Authority is the only way to ensure support can be delivered to neighbors when weather gets bad. Regional weather offices support the National Weather Services, and regional grid planning should support national grid planning. Do you guys still remember what it's like to get in line at the airport? There are only two ways to get through the security gate. You either buy priority access or you find an empty security station on the other side of the airport. If you look across the RTOs and regional planning authorities in the United States, you can see queues a mile long for interconnecting to the power system. In fact, there's almost enough generation in the queue to get us to 100% clean electricity. The way our industry interconnecting generation, the way that our industry is interconnecting generation isn't working. It's like trying to get around the security line at the airport by buying your own airplane. In some places, the lines are getting so long that developers are looking at developing resources in the darndest places. The endless search for a quick interconnection is slowing down the adoption of renewables, increasing the cost of decarbonization, and frustrating transmission modelers everywhere. A National Transmission Planning Authority can help solve this problem by identifying regions where the network must be expanded to allow for efficient decarbonization. The United States doesn't really need one plan. It needs a planning process. The relevant entities need to be assembled biannually to analyze system needs, conduct resource adequacy, production cost, stability, and feasibility analyses that result in the design and construction of regional transmission assets that can reach a broader national vision. This is a partnership. This isn't just one system coming in to replace another. It's not reasonable to expect a one-off planning process to provide the guidance needed to meet long-term decarbonization goals set by policymakers. The United States has the models, the data, and the expertise to create a national transmission plan. What it doesn't have is the process to create a plan, support it, and keep updating it as we build for a clean energy future. ERCOT's competitive renewable energy zones may be one of the most successful transmission planning activities ever conducted. Maybe CapEx 2020 is a close second, or maybe a tie. It clearly identified the location of the best wind resources in Texas and provided clear guidance to transmission developers and customers on where resources should be developed. A similar approach should be scaled nationwide. A future with 100% clean electricity is going to require carbon-free electricity to be developed practically everywhere. There, unpowered dams are present, generators should be added, and we should try to expand what we have of our existing hydroelectric system to help us reach that goals. Wind should be developed along the coast and in the Central Plains, and solar should cover rooftops and parking lots inside city borders, and large-scale solar should be deployed where the sun shines the brightest. This means everywhere, particularly in the South. We need to add a terawatt of wind and solar capacity to the United States electricity system. That's not a little, that's a lot. And we need to do it quickly to meet the president's 2035 and 2050 timelines. Designating renewable energy zones provides the clarity needed on where resources should be developed and where we need to build transmission to reach those resources. So let's talk about a couple principles that really guided us in understanding what a macrogrid should look like. First, connect regions with diverse load and generation profiles. The macrogrid will connect regions that have very different wind, solar, and load characteristics, as well as connect renewable energy zones to load centers. The next item is have the smallest cost and footprint possible. A national macrogrid or national transmission plan should be focusing on having the lowest cost feasible by maximizing the use of existing transmission, highway, and railway rights-of-way. We should also try to explore how we can take advantage of existing surplus transmission capability. Future interconnection points must take advantage of existing brownfield sites with surplus transmission capacity, thereby reducing the need for greenfield sites where entirely new substation facilities must be constructed. The next item is that we need to both tightly integrate and be able to safely separate when necessary. So these systems need to work best when they're together, but also work independently when the system conditions call for it. Finally, we need to have a network of transmission lines to minimize the risk of failure. It can't just be one line from point A to point B. It has to be a comprehensive network that is built out in multiple stages towards a common goal. Obviously, you can't build a cross-country network of transmission all at once. If we look at the next slide, It needs to be built out in stages, just like the federal highway power system. Eisenhower's plan originally said we'd be able to build the national highway system in 10 years. It took 62 years, and the final design wasn't exactly what they drew in 1955. Our plan recommends starting with projects that are already under development. Many of these projects connect resource-rich regions with the existing grid and could begin construction relatively quickly. Shovel-ready projects we identified in our paper are too small to reach the goal of 100% clean electricity on their own, and will likely need to be expanded and connected with other opportunities to get on this pathway. The National Transmission Planning Authority should lead a review of select projects and determine whether they can be redesigned to allow for expansion in subsequent years by adding additional conductors or expanding right-of-way. In the second stage of our design, individual macrogrid lines are connected into loops and collector systems that boost reliability and resiliency. The final stage of development for our vision is to review, update, and expand the macrogrid planning with input of the regional planning groups, which are involved all along the way, updated national policy goals, and guidance of the National Transmission Planning Authority. Next slide. This might come as a surprise to some of you, but I like big maps. And I cannot lie, if I'm doing a presentation, it's one thing I cannot deny. A map can convey so much information. It gives viewers a sense of space. It shows the connections between where a person is and where they could be. Maps show scale. Maps show possibility. This map shows the potential for uniting the country towards a common goal of decarbonization. Whether it's the SEAM study, another piece by Vibrant Clean Energy, or the newest design from Dale Osborne, the National Transmission Planning Authority will need to make big, beautiful maps if it wants to propel the country towards decarbonization. The map will need lines that are really large, perhaps 10 to 15 gigawatts in capability, that are going to crisscross the country, connecting resources, load, and weather systems. It needs to make the best use of the grid we have today and bolster the system we have for a more resilient, reliable, affordable, and equitable clean energy future. No one at ESIG would ever recommend building out the map that we see here exactly. This map conveys several critical messages about the scale, scope, and it generally lays out a vision or opportunity for US macrogrid. One of the things you might be able to see on the far right of the screen is the importance of an offshore collector system that could bring the resources along the East Coast and maybe even the West Coast to help balance the overall system needs and development. Because again, the critical path towards getting towards 100% clean electricity relies on balancing weather systems. And so we need to move at the scale of weather. The US should begin construction on a macrogrid as soon as possible, and it should build out that system in stages. So we've got a couple more recommendations about what needs to happen next. The first one is start immediately. It takes a long time to build transmission, and we need to get going. The next is to articulate the decarbonization vision and convene the major players so that they can have a seat at the table and help us figure out how we navigate to this path. The next item is designate an authority, either through existing legislation or new proposals that could be entertained for how we get on this path. Next, leverage national capabilities and industry expertise. We have the know-how, we have the tools, and we have the computation to reach these goals. We just need to choose to make it possible. Next, we need to figure out cost allocation and land use problems. And this is an area that I feel a little uncomfortable in as a technical energy person. Policy isn't really my bag when it comes to this, but we can't avoid the cost allocation issues and transmission siting problems that are impacting this transition to a clean energy economy. So if you want to learn more and you want to find out how you can engage in these topics, we've got an awful lot planned over the next several months over at ESIG. We've got a variety of virtual events, and we're really excited to have an in-person event this fall in Austin, Texas in late October. We've also got task force that are looking at a variety of topics, whether it's the role of hybrids, the impact of inverter-based resources, redefining resource adequacy, or trying to understand these transmission benefits. You can reach out to me or go to esig.energy to learn more. Thanks a lot, everybody, for having me on this panel today. I couldn't be happier to be here.
Thank you, Erin, for such an informative and entertaining presentation. You really set the tone of what it will take to make such a transformative vision a reality. So thank you. Your perspective of decarbonizing the electric system efficiently and affordably, the fact that it could require, doubling or tripling the size and scale of our nation's transmission system is really important to understand, and that it simply can't be done by thinking incrementally. Right? Your point that we need to think about all aspects of generation, distributed generation, and transmission transformatively. It's such a great theme for our entire discussion today. So as we look ahead at what's expected to be transformative build out and this accelerating pace of change that you've heard about, one question we need to ask ourselves is, do the same approaches, policies, procedures, will they work tomorrow as they did yesterday? Each project in the last major backbone build in the upper Midwest took between 7 and 14 years from conception to energization, which really puts us at 2030 at the earliest if we started today. And that was a time frame of accomplishment where everything went fairly smoothly. So what changes in approach or policy or improvements do we need to make given the accelerated need to get transmission infrastructure in place? So to discuss policy in the next regional build-out, we're incredibly grateful to have Chair Katie Sieben from the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission moderate our first panel. Chair Sieben has served as the Minnesota Public Utilities Commissioner since January of 2017, and in 2019, she was appointed to serve as chair of the Minnesota PUC by Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. Chair Sieben previously has served as a Minnesota legislator, and in her 14 years in the House and Senate, she has championed causes related to the environment, public education, and infrastructure. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chair Sieben.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Sieben, and thank you for that introduction, Pretty. And what a fantastic speech by Aaron Bloom. His discussion of the amount of transmission needed to reach clean energy goals was timely, of course, and highlights the need for those of us participating in today's conference to work cooperatively to advocate for transmission build-outs and investments. The Minnesota Commission, in fact, is currently urging the Biden administration and the Congress to pass the American Jobs Plan with transmission investments included in that legislation. Minnesota regulators are meeting with our members of Congress and their staffs, White House officials, and other policymakers to highlight the need for federal investment in transmission that will enable us to meet our state's clean energy goals and help make for a more reliable and resilient grid. It will also have the added benefit, of course, of increasing economic development and investment in rural communities across Minnesota and the Midwest. Significant investment in proposed MISO plans, for instance, could enable massive reduction in carbon emissions for the MISO region and smooth out or lessen some of the difficult cost allocation issues that Aaron touched on. So in fact, I'll use this opportunity now to ask each of you and the organizations that you work with to call or send letters of support to your respective congresspeople, urging them to support investments in hard infrastructure and transmission investments in the American Jobs Plan. The timing is critical, and I hope we can all use our networks to lobby for this investment. I thank our Midwestern governors and Governor Tim Walz for his leadership through the Midwest Governors Association for highlighting the need for transmission investments in the grid and the economic development opportunities that come with these infrastructure projects. Today, we have a distinguished panel of speakers to hear from on the policy positions needed to see this next phase of transmission build-out come to fruition. So let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. First, Lisa Agramonte is a utility lawyer whose practice focuses on permitting generation and infrastructure throughout the Midwest, including the CapEx 2020 transmission lines and hundreds of megawatts of wind projects. In her 2 decades of representing utilities and developers, Lisa has seen permitting mature from using maps and neon highlighters for route development to full integration of GIS and increasing sophistication of stakeholders in the permitting process. Julie Fedorchak is the chair of the North Dakota Public Services Commission. She has served as a commissioner since 2012 and heads the business operations, pipeline, electric transmission, and energy conversion siting, railroad, and consumer affairs portfolios. Julie serves as the president of the Organization of MISO States, vice chair of the NARUC Gas Committee, and vice president of the Gas Technology Institute's advisory board. Cade Ferris is the Red Lake Nation archaeologist, tribal historic preservation officer, and an Indigenous anthropologist, historian, and researcher who has spent his career working for Indigenous groups in Minnesota, North Dakota, and the surrounding region. He has over 2 decades of experience of finding creative solutions for cultural and natural resource management, conducting research for land, treaty, and resource issues, and building community capacity. Tom Hillstrom is a principal agent with Xcel Energy. He has been involved in infrastructure development and permitting for more than 20 years. Tom's experience includes managing siting and permitting efforts for the CapEx 2020 Hampton to La Crosse transmission line, the Huntley-Wilmarth line, and various other projects in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas. His experience includes route development, environmental review, public and agency outreach. And finally, David Moeller is a senior attorney and director of regulatory compliance for Elite Minnesota Power in Duluth, Minnesota. David handles regulatory and facility siting matters before the PUC, the Minnesota PUC, the North Dakota Public Service Commission, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission related to issues such as transmission, renewable energy, resource planning, and rate cases. David was project counsel for the Great Northern Transmission Line with responsibilities for all federal and state regulatory approvals. David also assisted in drafting Minnesota's transmission right of first refusal statute that withstood 2 constitutional challenges. So I have some questions to start, but really we want to also hear from you, our audience. What burning questions can you submit to energize our panel? Please transmit them via the question and answer feature in your portal. You can start by doing that now or as we go, and we'll be looking for your audience questions during the panel today. But I'll start with a general question. First to Chair Fedorchak. What is important to your constituents, Julie? What are they saying about energy, transmission, and generation?
Well, good morning, Katie. It's so good to see you. I appreciate you calling me Julie because Chair Fedorchak is just a mouthful. So I'm very good with the familiarity of first names. And thanks for being the moderator of this panel. It's fun to do this with you. It's great to be neighbors and facilitating a lot of interaction between our states and the Midwest region. And also thank you to all the people who put this conference together this morning. Such a timely topic. I feel like I spend most of my days talking about the need for more transmission in my role for at the Organization of MISO States. We just spend a lot of time talking about this and cost allocation. So it is really front and center. And really, though, from the perspective of my constituents, what people in my state care about more than anything, and what my job is not so much to facilitate the green energy transition. That's not in my job description at all. Actually, what my goal is and what my job is as a utility regulator is to support low cost or affordable, reliable electric service. And that's really what we see in our state. And in that comes, all the issues of the energy mix but ultimately North Dakota is very firm on those 2 things, reliable and affordable electricity. And so that's ultimately the purpose of my work. And then also we have a pretty strong role in the siting and permitting arena as well. Not all utility commissions do, but North Dakota does. And so we get involved in overseeing the permitting process of all the new electric generation facilities, the new transmission lines, and a large number of pipelines, both crude oil and gas. And so that, we wear a different hat there, and we look at environmental impacts and impacts to the people of our state of all of these new energy infrastructure that's being built. And our state law basically says, is very clear in providing for both development and environmental protection and balancing those two in a way that has minimal impact to the environment and the people here. So those are the lenses that I take to my job. I try to stay very, focused on what is and isn't my role. And some people don't like that because they want me to get into things that aren't really my job. But I think it's important for regulators. We are not policymakers, we're regulators. And I think it's important to listen to the direction given by the true policymakers who are elected by the people. So those are the things that are of concern to us, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And why don't I go next to Cade, to you. As a Red Lake Nation Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and the other work that you do, Mr. Ferris, with tribal nations across the upper Midwest, what is especially important to tribal members that you hear about often when it comes to the energy transformation we're seeing?
I think one of the main issues is ensuring that any development is sustainable and has as little impact as possible on the rights and resources of tribal nations. At one time, the entire, region was available to the tribes for their people and for their needs. But now those resources have been constricted. And if a project is not respectful of tribal needs, it runs the risk of being contentious from the start. I think one of the better options when it comes to development projects is to early engage with tribes and to make sure that tribes have a place at the table from the beginning, not when the regulatory requirements kick in, but from the very beginning when a project is conceived, so that those concerns and issues that tribes might have can be brought to the table and worked through before they become issues of regulatory requirement.
That's a really good point. And Tom, can I turn to you to build on that? In your over 20 years of working on development of transmission lines and clean energy projects, can you speak to some of the best practices to engage with local communities at the front end and how that helps speed the regulatory process and makes things move smoother?
You bet. And thank you, Chair Sieben. I'm happy to be here today. And you're right. One of the things that I can offer with my perspective is having gone through the process several times for several large projects and getting to see, the development of a project from the beginning, seeing it through the permitting process, even through the design and the construction and the end product. And when I see the fantastic vision of the future and the massive build out that's needed, it's just very exciting, but it makes me nervous too, because when I think about it, I think about the impact of all this infrastructure on the landscape and how important it is to do that with all the sensitivity that you can do. So to build on what Cade was saying, our outreach from the beginning of the development is crucial. What can drag a project out in a schedule is missing out on some of those critical early coordination efforts. When you have to start over and abandon a route and develop a new route because maybe you missed something, that has a big impact on project development schedule. So what we try to do from the beginning is identify the stakeholders, communicate with them and listen to their feedback, and to reflect that feedback in our route development process. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can talk about today.
Lisa, would you like to jump in there too? I know, like Tom, you have many years of experience in developing projects. And what are some of the best practices you see that help ease the regulatory process when it gets to regulators like Julie and I? You're on mute.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. I rode along with Tom on those CapEx projects and definitely have seen the evolution of route siting and permitting evolve. I think CapEx changed the method on which transmission was cited, certainly in Minnesota, to emphasize this pre-application process with outreach to potential stakeholders to gather as much information as possible to inform the route choices. As Tom mentions, if you miss something, then you have to restart. And one of the critical things for any project development, either transmission or generation, is predictability in your process and time frame. And so it's critically important for the community and the proponent that we gather as much information early in the process.
Lisa, when you just mentioned the word predictability, that made me think of how sometimes permitting can be difficult if there aren't set timelines or known timelines that developers and communities can depend on. So I'll move next to you, David. And do you have any suggestions or advice about laws or rules that could be changed to support the fleet transition? And do the laws and processes we have in place, are they working right now on the macro level overall?
Thank you, Chair Stephen, and thanks for being, I'm glad to be part of this opportunity, this panel. I think the laws for the most part are working well. I think we have to make sure we're doing them in an efficient manner, that we work with that we have the opportunities with stakeholders that are incorporated into, and that feedback is incorporated as we move forward. I think we've seen that as for solar and wind projects where there's certain exemptions that are in place. Maybe look at those for transmission lines. I think we also need to look at, are there ways to cooperate between states? Most, your the Minnesota Commission or the North Dakota Commission regulate within their borders. But as we're trying to build these larger projects that go across borders, we have to make sure that we're cooperating there and that there's alignment, not just on the border crossings, but on kind of the drivers behind these projects. And I think the other part too that we need to look at from a loss perspective is not just the routing, but also the need and kind of what's the need for these projects, and kind of work on those issues as far as both developing that story so that when we bring these projects to regulators, that need is clear, but also that we can articulate that for those stakeholders and understand that as we move forward.
Julie, you made a good point at the beginning about being a regulator and not a policymaker, but did anything stand out or jump out in your mind when I asked if there needs to be laws or rules changed in your state to support a resilient and reliable grid in the future?
Thanks, Katie. So because we are, the ones implementing our process, we are pretty engaged during every legislative session on tweaks to our siting laws. And, from my standpoint, I think North Dakota's laws are pretty solid. What really I think is necessary, and I 100% agree with everyone who has said early engagement, and long before you submit an application into our office, it's years that companies are usually working with various local folks, with tribal communities, et cetera, to really get the lay of the land and have them engaged in the footprint and making sure that they're avoiding, the sensitive areas. But that transparency, I think, is ultimately the key to all of it at every step of the way. The more transparency you have, the more, I know it's become kind of a buzzword, but when it comes to siting, there's just no replacement for that openness of here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's what our studies are, and really then allowing people along the way to have a voice. And we in North Dakota, we as commissioners, we participate in all of the siting hearings personally and listen to that community engagement. And I think that's extremely helpful. And as a commitment that I've made personally, I take, every single bit of input that's provided and address it during our meetings afterwards. Some of the stuff I can't do anything about, but to the extent that we can, we listen, we think about how this need or issue might be mitigated. And then, we do our best to do that and then move on. It's a balancing act. And of course, you can't please everybody, but I just think that when the public feels like they've had a fair voice and they've had an opportunity to be part of the process, even if they don't like the ultimate outcome, they're a little bit more willing to accept it and feel better about it. And in North Dakota, we've had a lot of challenges. We've had pipeline issues. And now the biggest thing in our state is wind development. There's a great wind resource in North Dakota, and a lot of developers want to come here, and we encourage that and appreciate that. But there's a fair number of folks in our state who also have opinions about wind development. And so, there's a balance there, and trying to work with the landowners and work with the communities to meet their needs as well. And wind facilities aren't subtle. You can't hide them, and we have no trees in our state to hide wind development anyway. So you see them very prominently. So it's going to be just coming up with the infrastructure to meet these goals, and getting it permitted and sited is a very significant task. So I don't think that there's any silver bullets that are going to make it easier, but I do think all along we have to focus on openness, giving people a voice, and being fully transparent.
Thank you for those comments. Tom, as you have worked on development of projects in various states, Julie touched on some of the opposition that can come from local communities, but what are some other, or could you build on that? What are emerging state or local issues which will challenge us on the next build out that we really need to see happen here? And what do we need to do collectively a better job of to address and anticipate these challenges?
Right, and I think Commissioner Fedorchak brings up excellent points. And one thing that I'll note is that each state has its own process, and they can be quite different, and they all work well for the state. But it's interesting to point out the differences, whereas Minnesota and Wisconsin sort of have in common a strong commission decision at the end of the process, where the commission selects the route, and in the Dakotas and in Iowa as well, it's more up to the utilities to develop the route. But emerging issues, our late projects have been in farmland for the most part. And what we're hearing more and more from farmers is, because of advanced, more industrial scale farming operations, that they don't want poles in their fields. And so one of the most important things that we can do is to avoid impacts to farmland. Other issues that we're finding more of is that seems to be more and more federal lands on the landscape. The Fish and Wildlife Service is developing more refuge properties that seem to just pop up, sometimes even in the middle of our project. And where we find federal lands, it's almost impossible for us to get right of way through those lands. And so as the refuge system is expanded, that's a pretty big impediment for us to develop new transmission lines.
Katie, could I follow up on Tom's comments there? Just it triggered something with me when he talked about avoiding the impacts to farmlands. So in North Dakota, we've seen, it used to be that the wind developers would put the turbines in the pasture lands where there's grazing, used for grazing, and that kept them out of the way of the farmers in their operation. But then the State Game and Fish and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife started looking at the impacts to native prairie. And native prairie is a very unique ecosystem. There's endangered species that live on it. And so there was, looking at collectively the impacts to native prairie throughout the state and the kind of patchwork impacts of, not having, these large tracts of native prairie and impacts to wildlife and plants. And so they started opposing the impacts to that native prairie and so pushing the turbines back into the farmland. So there's constantly that, that's a give and take. We've got it again in the next wind facility permitting process, that we've got issues between those two competing interests, and trying to thread that needle is not an easy, that's not an easy outcome for the companies or the people doing the permitting, the agencies. So it's one of those ongoing challenges I think is going to only increase as the amount of infrastructure increases.
Kate, can you build off of that? What are other emerging local issues that you see that will really serve as challenges, or that are challenges to the next build out?
Was that for me or somebody else?
Oh, sorry. I was asking Cade if he had anything to add to that in your work working on the landscape, especially. What other challenges do you see to the next build out?
Well, I definitely think that more attention needs to be paid to things like resource protection, and also to tree rights. One of the things that gets overlooked a lot is that these treaties have not been abrogated. In more and more cases, tribes are getting more and more treaty rights, and making sure that when a project does occur, that it's not infringing upon future land use is the key. Just like you're saying, we want to make sure that we protect farmland. We also need to make sure that we're protecting any future resources that might be used by local communities, tribes, and others, not just farmland, but any resource. Because with like Red Lake, for example, a lot of the land up in northern Minnesota has the potential to come back into the ownership of the tribe through a variety of mechanisms, especially some of those state lands up in around Beltrami Island. And so making sure that you are effectively discussing that with tribes, what their resource concerns are from the beginning, not just trying to cross the T's and dot the I's for the permit, because that runs the risk of, really running into some brick walls. I think that we had a really successful project with the Great Northern Power Line because Minnesota Power engaged the tribes directly and very early in the process, and were able to sit down across from tribal decision makers and actually hear some of those concerns and explain some of those potential impacts. And it was a successful project because there was an actual dialogue. And I think that having that dialogue, not being afraid to reach out to tribes, not looking at tribes as an impediment, but as a potential partner, because tribes have a lot of issues that might arise too. Looking at clean energy, green energy, that's something that I think has been discussed more and more between Minnesota Power and the tribes as a potential benefit for the tribe. finding some alternatives that might be more effective than some of these larger scale projects that could affect those resources. I guess I'd like to see definitely much more of a partnership engagement mentality as opposed to a checkbox on a permit.
All very good points. David, as Chief Counsel for the Great North Transmission Line for Minnesota Power and Elite, it must be gratifying to hear those remarks from Mr. Ferris. So what were some of the best practices in the Great Northern Transmission Line that our audience can learn from?
I think Kate did it really well as far as that early engagement. And then it wasn't just looking at, here's the reservation boundaries of the Red Lake Nation, and we're not going to put a line through there. It was like talking with them directly about those partnerships, about those opportunities, as well as kind of at all levels too. So it wasn't just, not just big maps, but tiny maps, but also working with our, CEO to chairman level, working with our environmental folks, that type of engagement on an ongoing basis. Then also recognizing, in addition to the work between Minnesota Power and Red Lake Nation, that there's also government to government type of discussions that have to happen, on these type of projects, whether it's in the formal Section 106 process or whether it's in other ways. But that, I think the work of Red Lake Nation was really key to that as well. And we really appreciated kind of that outreach that they did with other tribes and with other stakeholders. And then I think the other part too is to recognize that these projects have a lot of local benefits as far as tax base, whether it's on the for Red Lake Nation or whether it's for local governments, and those benefits do come forward as well. And so kind of maximizing those and maximizing what that need story is for those local benefits. But really, it's an ongoing dialogue. I mean, we started talking to Red Lake Nation 2 years before we filed a formal route permit application and a formal presidential permit application. And that time was so well spent, that even if the project took a long time, it still was worth it to have that early engagement.
So that your comments, David, just highlighted that build out of transmission can take or will take a long time. And I think Pretty said this in our opening comments as well. In that 8 to 10 year process, recognizing that it's so important to do a lot of work on the front end, what other steps or processes can be shortened to allow impacted parties to adequately participate, but also to speed up the process, since we know that so much transmission is needed in the near term? Who wants to take that question first? How about
chime in on that real quick? When it comes to getting ahead and making the process move smoother and move faster, I think from a tribal perspective, if you're talking about early engagement with tribes, also looking at utilizing some of the strengths and some of the potential within the tribes. Tribes have environmental specialists, biologists, wetland specialists, archaeologists. They have people who can do design and who can provide a lot of great input to help move the process along. In addition, when it comes to economic issues, one thing that gets overlooked a lot is that tribes have a workforce that's available. And so engaging with tribes in terms of potential economic benefits for individual tribal members, or with tribes that might have their own construction companies, being able to provide an economic outlet so that a tribe is not just a regulatory permit partner, but is also a potential partner in the development of the project, because there is a workforce that could be trained and utilized at the tribal level for a lot of these projects. And it's a great way to not just benefit some of the local economies along the route, but to really get an ongoing, long-lasting potential workforce and potential partner for these projects.
Really good point, and something that that our Minnesota Commission has been trying to focus more on by asking investor-owned utilities when they invest in large-scale generation projects to clean energy projects to report, for example, on the amount of jobs that were created and how that, and then we can see the more quantitative benefits to a local community. That obviously is happening in more rural parts of the state. Lisa, why don't I turn to you then, either on the how do you maximize the economic benefits of a project or ideas to shorten the project, since there's such a overwhelming need to bring more clean energy projects, including transmission, into the Midwest.
Thank you, Chair. I might take a stab at both of them briefly. With respect to economic benefits, I think we can learn from generation projects about capturing and describing the economic benefits that accrue to a infrastructure project. I think transmission line development started with NERC reliability criteria, and we said if you want reliable power, we need to build this transmission line, and it was a pretty simple story. It's now gone to we need this transmission line to deliver generation more broadly. And I think that you're going to see more applications, at least if I'm involved on the transmission side, talking about the local benefits in a more concrete and broad way. And that's just going to have to happen for the need story. So it's not going to be a NERC reliability issue that we can simply explain. It's going to be a more complex need story, which I think David mentioned. With respect to making the process shorter, I don't know that we need to make it shorter. I think there are good steps in all of the states that I work in. But as I mentioned earlier, my big concern for getting this infrastructure in the ground is the predictability of the process. I think Wisconsin, South Dakota, North Dakota have predictable timelines which the commissions need to act. I think that Iowa does not have a timeline. And Chair, I don't mean to pick on Minnesota, but while Minnesota has a timeline, it's not generally adhered to. And I think that part of the problem in Minnesota, which is in the middle of this region, is the relationship with the two agencies that do the hearing process and the environmental review process. And we have to have the environmental review done to do the hearing process. And that schedule is not something that's within generally the control of the commissions. I think there's a structural challenge in Minnesota that's not present in other states that I would love to see resolved someday, so that our statutory timelines would be something that we're more certain. And certainly big projects like CapEx have waived those timelines more expressly because they're big projects. We want to make sure that the public has an opportunity to participate.
Fair criticism, I'll just say. Tom, what ideas or suggestions do you have? And do you agree with Lisa that it's not about shortening the timeline, the 8 to 10 years from conception to energization, but rather having a more predictable timeline? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. One of the things I'll note is that our most recent project, Huntley to Wilmarth, we'll have that finished in 5 years, and that's from conception to energization. So the process can work quicker if you avoid hangups. And like we talked about earlier, hangups are finding out that a route is infeasible and having to start over. Another big hangup, I think, is becoming embroiled in a federal process. Federal processes are just notoriously unpredictable and lengthy. So we try to avoid, like the example I had before, going through federal lands. One thing that I think cannot be short-circuited, as Commissioner Fedorchak mentioned earlier, people have to have their voice heard. People have to understand that they have a valid role to play. So we can't short-circuit that. And then I want to go back to the point about local benefits. One of the best things that I heard at a local task force meeting is a county commissioner said to a group of people, look at the tax rolls of our county and who is at the top of the list as far as paying property tax. And it's utilities, because all of this infrastructure is very expensive and there's high local property taxes paid on it. So highlighting that as a local benefit, I think, is important.
We have an audience question that came in that says, how can we help public understand the need for significant transmission build out to support the resource transformation in advance of specific projects? Reducing generation emissions can't happen without land use impacts of transmission. Who would like to take a first stab at that question? David?
Sure. I think the need story, and then we did this on Great Northern, and the CapEx lines did it really well too, is that it's not just a single transmission line from one substation to another substation, that it's a larger picture, kind of what it means for the grid, what it means for regional reliability, what it means for LMPs, how's it going to change prices, how's it going to change wind deployment. We had studies about that, with Great Northern about how it's going to help wind in North Dakota. And I think we need to kind of broaden that picture as far as kind of what the need story is. And I think also you need to kind of bring it down to a local level as well and kind of be out there and engage. I mean, Commissioner Fedorchak's comment about going out to those public hearings and how the three commissioners go to those public hearings, I think is really helpful in North Dakota. And, the Minnesota Commission's doing that as well with more outreach, especially greater Minnesota where these projects are going to be built. And so I think more we can be out there and engaging not just the utilities and the developers, but also the commissions and the regulators. And then maybe one other part too, and this probably also goes to the, how to shorten the time period, is that to get engagement from the other agencies, before you even file applications. I think that's sometimes a challenge where this isn't a real project until we file a route permit application. But I think that also goes to showing that need as well, that if a state agency is involved early on or a federal agency is involved early on, even before you file applications, I think that helps kind of tell that story both for local constituents as well as other stakeholders.
Julie, did you want to add on to that too?
Sure, just a couple thoughts. First of all, I really appreciate Lisa and Tom emphasizing that maybe we don't need to shorten things or speed things up, because I think once the public hears that, they think, okay, we're going to be the ones that are shortchanged. We're going to have less of a say. And so I think that it's important for the industry to not be arguing for speedier. I think others can make those arguments, but I don't think the industry should. I just think it looks like you're trying to ram things through. So very wise there. I would say there's a couple of things that North Dakota doesn't have that I think help us a lot. We don't have in our siting criteria the whole need issue. Like, it's not in there. So when people come to me and say, this isn't needed, this isn't, and I can just say, listen, that's not one of the criteria. The company doesn't have to demonstrate a need. We can't consider need in the issue of the permitting. We look at the impact factors, environmental, cultural impact. Those are our criteria. And that saves us, a lot of time. It saves companies a lot of time and money, and things don't get tangled up in the whole need issue, because boy, when you go down that path, I mean, everybody can argue against the project and say it's not needed. If they just don't want it. So that helps us. And then also to David's point about the engagement with other agencies, we rely heavily on other agencies because we don't have very many experts in, the specific components of, say, like archaeology or biology, and we don't have those experts on staff. We rely on our state agencies and federal agencies for that expertise. And in our law, it says, if you didn't let us know you had a problem, we assume you don't have a problem. So it's very helpful that we can just say, well, we asked, you didn't express a concern, So, you know, we moved forward and they know that. And I think that helps speed things along in our state tour. It just helps support certainty, like others were saying.
One thing that I see a problem with that is, you know, is a lot of times if you engage with, say, the tribe, for example, you will do better to engage early on the project so that you can head off those potential problems rather than relying on, say, the SHPO or a state agency who might be overwhelmed with a lot of projects, especially in places like North Dakota where you have so many oil and gas projects that occur. People are very overwhelmed. Tribes are overwhelmed as well, but if you can engage early, it'll speed things up. If you wait until it hits that level where you have to assume that there's no issue and move forward, then you run into potential problems. You run into potential for flat out opposition to a project. Because if a person doesn't feel that they've been listened to or talked to or informed, then they will definitely put up those brakes. They'll put up those roadblocks. I think it's better to, start early in the process. I mean, if a project's going to take 8 to 10 years, why are you waiting until there's 2 years left to engage somebody? You've wasted all that potential money that you can save, or that potential time you can save, by engaging early in the project, so that a person actually feels like they've had some input in the outcome, as opposed to just being a checkbox in the overall permitting process.
I 100% agree with that, Mr. Ferris. And I think the companies in North Dakota understand that too, at least from my perspective. I know Excel, all the wind developers are very engaged with the tribal community, years in advance, looking at the impacts, because they know ultimately one of the SHPO in our state is really engaged. They never just say we can't help because we're overwhelmed. They always, we wait for them. We wait for their engagement. If we haven't heard from them, we don't move forward without their review and their, it's not necessarily approval, but they say that, this route is acceptable or whatever. So the tribes or the companies in North Dakota are engaging the tribal archaeological resources well in advance, and looking at maps and looking at, where sensitive areas are and avoiding those. I know, Tom, you probably have some really powerful examples. I know there was a wind farm that was developed in a pretty sensitive tribal area, and you guys moved, facilities all around to avoid those sites. It was, it was really something to be proud of. The engagement and the tribal community really appreciated, and it was very supportive in the end.
Tom, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular example, but it's a very common thing that we do to minimize impacts. Once we end up with a general route, there are a lot of opportunities to minimize impacts through engineering, through, like Commissioner Fedorchak mentioned, that you can move structures and stay within your approved route to avoid and minimize impacts. It's a very common and useful tool.
I think it's fair. One thing that is a recurring theme is that there needs to be coordination amongst local communities, developers, policymakers, whether it's, folks at the regulatory level, the state legislature, federal delegations. There's so much coordination that needs to happen to lead to a better outcome for the public. And I think what we've heard consistently is that engagement needs to be respectful. It needs to be begin from the start, and that will really lead to better decisions by regulators. I I think it's also fair to point out that in some states, as there's more pressure on state agencies, the state agencies themselves are not always, they don't have as many resources as needed. And so from my perspective, it would be helpful to have regulators, policymakers, and developers, energy companies saying that it's important to invest in the human capital that's needed to help make this coordination happen, and ultimately to allow the permitting to be smoother and to happen more quickly. Julie, I see your head nodding. Lisa, you touched on earlier some of the challenges between that you see in Minnesota, but do you also see challenges across states where state agencies or tribal agencies, as Cade mentioned, need more people to help make this happen?
And resources is definitely a concern. I think in other states it's been managed by pre-application consultation with the agency too, and timing applications so that they slot in as best they can with the staff's existing workload and the commission's anticipated workload. I think that there are certain applicants who would be willing to, provide additional funding for project-specific resources for those timeline concerns. But I don't know how to exactly implement that, because I know there are state contracting requirements for agencies for hiring. But that would be one possible solution. I don't know if long-term how to support, what would be the right mix of additional resources to make that happen. And I do want to clarify, when I was speaking about the timeline, I wish it weren't 8 to 10 years for a transmission line project. I'm working on one right now that we're going into year 10, and it's just starting to be constructed. But I was thinking more of the state permitting process. I also want to recognize that Tom is absolutely right. Once you tap into federal processes, it is very difficult to wrangle the schedule and to wrangle the steps in the process to get from conception to construction.
We're getting close to our wrap-up time, but Julie, since you're the president of OMS, which I'm sure participants are familiar with, that it's the organization of MISO states, and we work cooperatively as regulators to advocate for our regional grid. What takeaways do you have as president of OMS now for folks on this call in terms of how important it is to work cooperatively in the future?
Well, yeah, I think that I think we've seen just in the last year and even in recent weeks the importance of how important we are to each other in states, just in terms of maintaining reliability and keeping the grid strong. And so we have to have, with the new technologies and the new types of generation that are coming on and are really exciting. I mean, the innovation that's occurring is just blows your mind. And I think it's going to be great to see how all of this evolves. But I think that we have to be engaged in the process, and we have to recognize that our power goes between states, and when one state doesn't have it, another state might, and we have to have, the only way to get it to each other is through transmission lines. And so we definitely need to shore up our grid. I'm probably one that isn't, eager to sign off on the $500 billion of new generation and transmission projects necessary to meet the 2050 goals that are out there. I just think that's more than what we're going to be able to accomplish and safely. So, but that said, we always need to be building and shoring up the system so that we can better get energy to where it's needed and maintain reliability and the safety for all of our citizens. This industry is only 7% of the economy, but it is the most important 7%, because without it, we don't have an economy. So we have to get this right. Everything else depends on having power, and things quickly devolve and digress into chaos without it. And so we have to keep our eye on that ball and keep everybody engaged and at the table and working together.
Great closing comments, Commissioner Fedorchak or Chair Fedorchak. Thank you to all of our distinguished panelists for your perspectives today. We really appreciate it. And I'll now turn the virtual baton back to Pretty.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Sieben, and a big thanks to all of the panelists for such a great, robust discussion. You know, all of your perspectives on community and public engagement, and not just engagement for the sake of a regulatory process, but true engagement, are so important. You know, hearing the words respectful, early, meaningful dialogue. The goal of our industry is first and foremost to serve people. We need to create even new vehicles for engagement and accessibility, making sure that everybody's empowered, can play a role in developing our energy future without sacrificing what many of you said, the timelines. David, I really appreciated your perspective on the need for state-to-state understanding and cooperation. Kate, I really appreciated your comments around the need to have real dialogues, you know, a deeper understanding with one another, even when there's not a project on hand. And Chair Fedorchak, you know, finally, your call out to the collective need for reliability is really our North Star, right? So thank you again to all of you. Let's take a well-needed 15-minute break, and then we'll convene with our second panel after that. Welcome back, everyone. We'll move now to our next panel, where we're joined by those who are on the front lines of reliability. And really, it's the quiet confidence of our system operators, those who are on the deck monitoring and responding to the system 24/7, and having some of the best understanding of what works and doesn't work in that critical hour. So as we look ahead at not just the incremental changes, but really the wholesale or transformative changes to the grid, what needs to change from the operator's perspective? And I'm pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, Joanne Thompson, who will be moderating this panel. Joanne has been with Otter Tail Power Company since 1997 and has been Vice President of Asset Management since 2014. And in this role, she's accountable for the company's electric transmission and distribution system, including FERC and RTO policy. And prior to this current role that she's in, she held other positions at Otter Tail Power, primarily in system operations. So welcome, Joanne.
Well, thank you, Pretty. I'm so pleased to be here, and what a great start to the day. And I think we're going to continue right into this great day with our panel on operations. You know, with reliability as our North Star, is the transmission system in the upper Midwest prepared to deliver tomorrow's energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Are we going to have a reliable and resilient system? We have the right group of experts to explore the answers to these burning questions. Like Pretty noted, we don't oftentimes get to hear the voice of the operators, but I've got them with us today. Our esteemed panelists combined have more than 125 years of experience operating the grid. So here to visit with us about our North Star, reliability, I'm so pleased to introduce our panelists. Renuka Chatterjee. Renuka is the Executive Director of System Operations at MISO. Renuka has more than 20 years of regional transmission and operations experience with the Midwest Independent System Operator and Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. You can tell I'm old school. And she was instrumental in establishing MISO's reliability and market services. Dick Pursley is the Director of Operations at Great River Energy. Dick has more than 32 years of experience and is well known in the industry for his active participation in a variety of NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and the Midwest Reliability Organization, the MRO. Very experienced with reliability, operations, and security committees of those organizations. Todd Sarkinen has more than 35 years of experience at Xcel Energy and is the Senior Manager of Transmission Operations. Todd also has been a leader in our region, actively leading and engaging in MISO and MRO reliability and operations committees. Lloyd Linke is Vice President of Operations for the Western Area Power Administration, Upper Great Plains region. Lloyd is also well known and respected in our industry for his nearly 40 years of utility experience and long-standing leadership in numerous reliability organizations such as NERC, MRO, and the Southwest Power Pool. Renuka, Dick, Todd, and Lloyd, in that order, will help line us up due north with their opening thoughts on operating our future system, and then we'll go into some Q&A. Renuka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for this opportunity. As we think about reliability and how we operate today, we already operate differently today compared to even just 5 years ago. Uncertainty management is at the top of the list. We are more in the continuous risk assessment mode, where we are continuously preparing for that operating time frame. I tell you, even 5 years ago, we still viewed summer peak as the or your peak situation as the condition for which the system operators focus on or prepare for. And if you prepared for the peak, then you were good for the rest of the day or the rest of the time or the rest of the year. That is no longer holding true. If you look at the events we have had in the last 5 years, most of our events are, I call them events, but situations that require us to take actions to maintain reliability that are beyond normal operations occur mostly in the spring months and sometimes in winter. Not that they haven't occurred in summer, but they do tend to occur year-round is the point. And as you look at what is reliability, I feel like the definition and the priority is evolving. When you take a classic look at the system operator's definition of reliability, it includes what I would call a controlled load shed, meaning, if load shed is required to protect the reliability of the grid, that is a necessary tool in the system operator's toolbox. But if you look at the general public and even think about what happened in Texas a few months ago, small R reliability, consumers don't think of turning lights being turned off as reliability at all. So while one could argue what happened is actually a good reliability, capital R reliability outcome, we are slowly evolving to the situation where we have to keep the lights on all the time, and that's going to require a different level of preparation and planning to achieve the same.
I guess I'm up next. My name's Dick Pursley. I'm with Great River Energy, and I'm going to focus more on the data needs that, Renuka talks about, having that flexibility and awareness every hour of every day, and that's what we do every day. And with the changing resource mix and more sources and more sources of the electrons, it requires more data needs. And with that, more advanced tools to help the operators. In the past, they used to have to manage a handful or tens of generation units. Now they have to handle hundreds. And the interconnectedness of all those facilities and with our other utility partners has become more and more important. And that data exchange and transfer and the tools that manage that data have become more and more important, and it's just starting to develop. So that's what I see as a big issue as we try to maintain our reliable systems, is really developing those tools, helping the operators, because when you sit in an operator chair, it can be calm, and then all of a sudden it's hectic just fear that happens. And think of it as an air traffic controller, but 10 times over. It's really a stressful position, and it's really their focus is really to keep the lights on and to keep people happy. And you know, that perspective has to be taken into account when we develop policy decisions and focus not just on the economics of the transformation, but also on the reliability of the transformation. So I'll turn it over to the next panelist. Thanks.
That was a great visual for us, Dick, to bring us into the seat of the operator. Todd, I welcome your opening comments on lining us up due north for the future operations of the system.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Todd Sarkinen with Xcel Energy. And thank you for allowing us to share what our dedicated, well-trained transmission system operators are doing to maintain reliability 24/7. We hope to give you a glimpse of what it means to operate the transmission grid that is so critical to moving generation to serve the customers. You know, operating the grid is all about staying within limits. I'm not trying to oversimplify them, but frequency control. This is the balancing issue that Aaron brought up. And just to set the stage, MISO has the lead on frequency control. They're matching generation to load, but the transmission system operators have a role. You know, we need to make sure the grid's there to move the generation to where the load is. The second thing is in voltage control. And this is one where the transmission system operator has a primary role. MISO also has a role, but operators are already experiencing changes in this area. It used to be a day-night phenomenon. You put the capacitors in on the day, take them in at night, put in your reactors to pull down the high voltage. It's no longer like that. Now we have high wind, low wind situation. We have fast ramps. All of a sudden you have a lot of power cutting across your system. You're quickly trying to get reactive resources online. So this is some challenges the operators are already seeing, and I think it's going to get, you know, more challenging for them. The two main things they do then is they're monitoring the grid. Like Dick said, this is a quiet time. They're continually assessing the system, but occasionally you do have disruptions. Our equipment's out in the elements. We have stuff fail, so they have to respond to alarms, outages, and part of this monitoring is also looking ahead. We want to make sure we're within limits in real time, but if the next thing happens, we also need to make sure we're within limits. And this is something we're working with hand in hand with MISO to make sure this happens. And then the biggest piece of our work is maintaining the system. This is our biggest activity for the control center and the support staff. That continually outages are being requested for maintenance, public encroachments, bridge contractors. So the goal here is to keep the system resilient during these maintenance outages, and then also having recall plans that if conditions change, you can get the system back to normal. So I'll just close, say operators they're dependent on all the hard work done by those shaping the grid and the generation resources, the planners, the regulators, and giving us margin. So when things do happen, we can keep the lights on. It is greatly appreciated. So thank you.
Another great window into the challenges with operating the system in real time, Todd. Thank you. And Lloyd, a little birdie just shot me a note that I understand you've had a promotion recently and you're now the regional manager of the Upper Great Plains. So I apologize for going off of an older bio. Congratulations. And with that, that must mean you've got great introductory remarks for us.
Well, I'm not sure if just getting a title makes you all that much more smarter. But yes, thank you. And it's an honor to be part of this panel. Lloyd Linke with Western Area Power Administration. part of the honor is that we're not even a participant in the Grid North partnership, and so to be invited to speak at their conference and be on one of their panels is a great honor. As I think of the true north and reliability of the grid, we've done such a great job in the past of managing the system and keeping the lights on, that while we've always said, we can do a controlled curtailment of load, as Renuka talked about, nobody really thought that was going to happen. I mean, and we did such a good job that people said, well, yeah, that's fine. You've got that in your toolkit, but you're never going to use it, and so just keep the lights on. And so maybe we shouldn't have done as good a job in the past as we have, but I think right now, the definition of reliability is, to keep the lights on, and part of doing that as we move forward is recognizing that as we have all these new resources coming on to the system, that they each have their different characteristics. That a 500 megawatt steam plant is not the same as a 500 megawatt gas, or a 500 megawatt hydro, or a 500 megawatt wind or solar project. They all have different characteristics. And as we move forward, we're going to have to recognize those characteristics that are different, whether it be the inertia, whether it be that there are certain other limitations on those resources. As we plan for moving forward into the next day, we need to make sure that we're not utilizing resources or doing things that would reduce our flexibility in the future to be able to use a particular resource. And I think Dick talked about all the tools. Those are going to be very important, because part of what we're doing today, even though the operator wants margin and enjoys margin and lives for margin on the system, everybody else is working to get the most out of the system. The planners and the resource entities, they want to minimize the investment in additional transmission. They want to get their generation on at the lowest cost possible. And so everybody else is trying to get the most out of the electrical power system. So as we can get tools that'll help us, maybe not get the margin, but at least margin back, but at least we'll have tools that'll allow us to reliably operate closer to the edge. And so, I'm looking forward to hearing what the panel has to say about the different tools and those sorts of things, as I'm sure we'll get to a question related to that. And just to end it, I agree with everything that's been spoken so far by the other panelists, so I just won't repeat all of that. So I'll turn it back to you, Joanne.
Thanks, Lloyd. Wow, I knew this was going to be a great panel, and great opening comments from each of you. So Renuka, you touched upon this, as did your colleagues. I'm going to kind of start from the top and peel away the layers of the onion as we really dive into the operations. But with reliability as our North Star, is the transmission system in the upper Midwest prepared to deliver tomorrow's energy? 24 hours, 7 days a week. What does that 24/7 reliability mean to you?
Yeah, so again, as we all touched upon it, load shed is not a tool that we, when used, is liked by anyone, right? So, and I'll tell you, as a system operator, we don't like using it. None of our operators like using it either. So from a 24/7 reliability perspective, I think we have a number of things to focus on to make sure we are actually reliable. Generation performance is key. Even on a normal day, it's key. It's not just for extreme events or high peak days. It's that 24/7 that you touched upon, Joanne. System operators are relying on the generation to be there in the right amounts that they said they would be there, right? So again, there is some float in the system, but not so much that we can absorb huge changes. So we need that performance. Secondly, I think, we touched on forward-looking policies, right? So be it transmission build or how you think about resource adequacy. From a transmission perspective, just looking back at, I keep tying back to the February event because, system operators have a way of talking about an event as an example. What we learned was the transmission system was crucial to transfer that power to where it was needed, right? The last big transmission investment was in 2011 with the multi-value projects. And the resource portfolio has changed in 10 years. So we'll have to look at how we can get that generation to the load centers. I'll tell you, there are lots of arguments about whether transmission is an efficiency project or a reliability project. As a system operator, I'll tell you, every transmission line is for reliability in real time. And nothing is for efficiency. I mean, again, we want to achieve that reliability efficiently. But lately, the question in the control rooms is one of how much risk do we want to take, because you don't have many options last minute other than to shed load, right? So if we are too late in taking those proactive actions, we don't quite have, that margin in the end or the cushion, if you will, that we enjoyed for many years. From, again, keeping the reliability and lights on, Lloyd touched on, we have done such a good job and we have to continue that into the future. Operations is changing, even in my own experience, I'd say operating like 1,500 generators is different than operating 15,000 distributed energy resources. So we'll have to get smarter in terms of technology and tools that are, that are much needed in the control room. I encourage everyone, if you have not already, to Google Operations of the Future video on the MISO website. Again, not as a commercial, but it's just trying to point to the kind of tools, automation, and human performance and skill sets that are going to be needed in the future. So, reliability is also about having the right people to take those actions in the control rooms. And lastly, and I'll say reliability is the outcome of multiple years of planning. The goodness that Lloyd referred to that we've enjoyed for all these years was the outcome of the decisions that were made many, many years ago, 30, 40 years ago. It's now our time to make those right decisions and have the right debate, right? Again, it's all about setting up that future reliability. But there are a number of questions in there on, okay, if you're going to use gas generation, do we need fuel? And whose job is it to ensure that fuel sufficiency or, fuel transportation requirements? And I think about MISO specifically, we are not in a good position to say whether we should have those requirements or not, but if we don't have them, then what choices do we have? So our job is to point out those outcomes for the industry to consider those debates. So there is a number of things that we must do to continue to maintain that good reliability going forward. And I look forward to all of those debates. I think in many ways we are re-electrifying America with new fuels, so we'll have to think about things differently.
Wow. I have many forks in the road where I can take this conversation. Thanks for that. It's a complex answer with a balance of multiple tensions, competing tensions, intermixed with flexibility and many tools in the tool chest. I think I'm going to go to you, Lloyd. You had touched upon this in your opening comments. And it certainly, Renuka brought this up as well. And I believe this is a question that's on the mind of many. And with the changing resource mix, will that impact day-to-day operations and decision-making?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to move to a mode where we're talking about resource adequacy, and that not as Renuka and others had talked about, that it's, you have enough capacity to get through the peak, and then, you're going to be good for the rest of the year or the rest of the day or whatever. You're going to have to think of resource adequacy as more of an energy aspect, looking to what sort of energy you're going to need this hour, next hour, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, maybe at the end of the week, and then looking at the resources that you have available, and then backing into your capacity needs at the particular time with the particular resources. Because you don't want to take action today that would limit you from being able to utilize something tomorrow and be short tomorrow. For just as an example, I mean, batteries are talked about as being, the saving grace for the system operator as far as resource adequacy, and they're going to be a valuable tool. Don't get me wrong; they're going to be needed, and they're going to be very, very valuable. But they don't create any energy. They only store energy that was created earlier. So if you're planning on using a battery tonight to meet your needs, you better make sure that you charge it today. And if you're in a tight energy situation, you decide not to charge that battery because you're tight on energy and load, and your resources are tight, so you don't charge it because that battery is going to look like a load while you're charging it. All of a sudden tonight, when you were planning to use that battery, there's nothing in it. So we need to be looking ahead, and it's not only just renewables. In the New England ISO, they're looking at it because they have environmental limits on their gas resources, and so they don't want to use all of their time on a particular unit up, and then they don't have it tomorrow or next week. So we need to start looking at the energy needs, not only for this hour, the next hour, but even tomorrow and the next day, just to make sure that we have that energy there. And that's going to be the definition of resource adequacy. Because I know in the SPP, during their load curtailments here in February, the first one happened a couple hours after the peak. That's in the old mindset. Whew, we made it through the peak. Things are good. We're safe. Well, no, we weren't. So it's, you need to be looking ahead to make sure that you have those resources for the next hour, the next day, because these events are seeming to be more than just an hour or two event. They're day events, multiple day events.
Joanne, if I may add a little bit to the storage issue that Lloyd touched on, there were straight 39 hours of no wind in the MISO footprint, I believe last year, 39 hours. So when we think about storage, that's the time frame that you're looking at. So as a system operator, we have to plan those resources knowing that wind is not available for those 39 hours. So again, just adding to the point that we'll have to think about, sufficiency every hour.
Yeah, I think a theme I'm hearing, and we heard the conversation around timing in the earlier panel, that was timing related to the evolution of the development of transmission. Here we're talking about the timing of technology, the timing of resources, the timing of how we go into the day to operate the system. So we've got short-term time frame, long-term time frame. Dick, I'm curious from you on that timing question, just how does timing come into the reliable 24/7 operations of the grid of the future?
To answer that question, I think we have to be really measured in our timing. If we look at timing from a power supply perspective, we have to be measured, and Lloyd brought it up that we have to consider the characteristics of the power supply, the different options, and what their capabilities are and how they can be utilized. And Renuka touched on it too. There's hours in the day where certain resources aren't available. You know, having conversations with RTO management, you know, you can put different resources in the system, but there's still periods of time based on weather patterns where those resources won't be available. So, you know, you have to take that measured approach and make sure that you're planning for each hour of the day. And you're not only doing it for tomorrow, but you're doing it for 3 years from now, so that you're not backing yourself up, you know, to a ledge. And you don't have to dust off your load shed plan to be using it more often. So I think we have to really, from a timing perspective, be really measured, let the technologies catch up, and really focus on a plan. And one thing that I see that's a little bit lacking is a national policy on that plan. You know, it's hard to do these plans. I think one of the speakers brought up earlier in the symposium, regionally. It has to be a national focus. It has to be the moonshot. It has to be, if we really want to transform the way we do things with one of the best electrical systems in the world, if not the best, we have to take that measured approach, and we have to be careful about it, and we have to be coordinated about it. And it has to have government involvement, because those resources are needed. It can't be done by Otter Tail, by Great River, by WAPA. You know, it has to be a coordinated approach. The other aspect from a transmission perspective, it's really about recognizing that it does take long lead times to get facilities built. And when they're getting built, you have to rip up the system sometimes to get these facilities built. So you have to have careful planning, because you might not have all the facilities that you currently have during the construction phase. So, you know, that's careful planning, looking out ahead, engaging all the stakeholders, really focusing on getting to that end game and recognizing that you have to be a real proponent that these facilities are needed to move these electrons from, you know, places that usually don't have the load to places that do have the load. So, you know, that's where I kind of look at the timing aspect. It's really the whole gamut. It's, you know, planning for tomorrow, but planning for 5 years from now. Hopefully that answers your question, John.
Thanks, Dick. It answers the question, and I don't think the answers or actions get any easier, but certainly we're on top of this. We're moving forward. I just had a couple of questions come in from the audience. Todd, I'm going to direct this one to you. So here's a question. Aaron Bloom discussed inverter challenges with changing fleet in his keynote remarks. What are grid operators doing now and planning for in the future as more coal plants shut down to ensure reliability to ride out the perturbations, I hope I said that right, in the system?
Thanks, Joanne. So the thing that comes to mind is MISO has this RIA study, Renewable Integration Impact Assessment. It's easier to say RIA for me, by the way, but anyways, they say in there that up to 30% penetration of renewables on the upper Midwest, that I think you can get there fairly easily. But once you start going higher, there are new technologies needed to provide that inertia, that voltage support. So I think the planners are working with that RIA study, and as the base loads shut down, they're working to provide the similar capabilities, the inertia, the reactive support. That's, yeah. So I think that in that RIA studies the kind of one of the guides here to let us know what's needed.
Hey, Joanne, if I could, I could add to that a little. You know, at the NERC level too, there's an effort to really standardize and look at what those resources need to provide to the grid. And so there are efforts to create those standards, create those specific essential services that might be needed from those resources, and make sure that when they are connected to the grid, there's some commonality and some assurance that they're set the way that we think they are, so we can model them effectively. So there is an effort nationally at the NERC level as well.
Joanne, if I may add a little bit to that, certainly the infrastructure needs to come in to provide the necessary, inertia and voltage support. But at the same time, I think as system operations, we are investing in real-time voltage monitoring, and we have tools today to do real-time dynamic and transient stability studies, which in the past used to be more like a day-ahead study. So today in real time, we're investing in those tools. And, in fact, MISO has an online, what we call the transient stability and voltage stability study that's monitoring for these inertia and voltage problems on a proactive basis in the next hour, next few hours. That's going to become more and more important as the fleet changes as well.
Yeah, and if I may just interject a little bit too. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, but the one thing that has to be recognized, I think the markets, if you're in a market or if you're outside a market, there has to be some way to incentivize and pay for these services. You talk to the industry folks on the inverters, and they say the inverters can provide you inertia, they can provide you a frequency response, they can do all of this stuff. But the one thing they don't mention very often is that comes at a price. It reduces the capacity of the units, of that wind unit or that solar unit. They're holding something back in order to provide that inertia. And when you're holding something back, that party isn't getting paid because that energy isn't being produced. So there has to be a way to incentivize folks to be wanting to do that. It could be through standards requiring it, or it could be through market type of incentives to pay for somebody to say that, yeah, I'll set up my inverter so that I'm holding something back so I can give it to the system when it's needed. But it isn't a simple solution. I mean, some of this technology is there and can be provided, but you have to make sure the people providing it are being compensated for that.
I'm going to stay with you on that point, Lloyd, before I jump to the next audience question on the compensation and the role that markets plays. I'm going to tee this up for Lloyd and Renuka, an SPP perspective and a MISO perspective. From the SPP perspective, are you aware, is the conversation or are there efforts underway to recognize this important element of the role that markets and recognizing the value of the resources that provide these various services for reliability? Is that conversation, has that started and is it underway?
Well, coming out of the event that we had here in mid-February, there's a lot of discussion on it may be highlighted as resource adequacy and that, but a lot of it is discussion about, how can you incentivize the gas units in the South to winterize? Should people be incentivized to have fuel storage on site instead of just relying on pipeline deliveries? There's discussions along those lines across the board as to what can be done in order to ensure that the energy is there, the fuel is there, which relates to the energy, whether it be, gas or the wind or the sun. Currently in the Southwest, the solar production is down due to the smoke from the wildfires. So everything can have some sort of variability in their output, and we just need to be able to look at that, and as I said in my opening statement, recognize those characteristics. It isn't that we can't operate the system reliably with the change in resource mix. It's just that we have to develop and decide how to do it reliably, and it's going to be different than it is today.
Thanks, Lloyd. Renuka, do you have anything to add from a MISO perspective?
Yeah, I'd say that I think, Lloyd touched on availability and, availability, flexibility, and visibility. All three are important to the system operator. From a market perspective, we are looking at price formation as a holistic element on what things should you consider as ancillary services. Today, you look at markets and they really price energy and then they price ancillary services. And mostly ancillary services are a byproduct of just serving energy today. And maybe still until, as someone pointed out earlier, till you get to that break-even point of renewable penetration. But as you look into the future, we'll have to explicitly price those ancillary services. And we may be paying more for ancillary services than we pay for energy. And that'll be a new world for all of us to kind of live in and grow with.
Yeah, I've got a new theme I'm hearing, changes in the air. Yeah. In addition to the complexity and balancing of these myriad complexities. Say, Todd, I'm going to direct the next question to you. Given your wealth of experience in transmission operations, and back in the day, we talked a lot about stability, given that we all on the panel today we talked a lot about stability with like the North Dakota export, which thankfully has gone away with the advent of the regional transmission organizations. But here's a question from the audience. Traditionally, operations could study a few bookends to avoid instability. With wind and solar variability, how can operations best manage these variables and inverter instability? Todd, do you want to take that one first, please?
Yeah, I can take a shot at it, and I'm sure others can help out too. I think this goes back to the modeling and variability of these resources, better even characteristics of the load as we get distributed energy resources. That the bookends where we used to study, one condition and everything's fine, so we're good. In the operator experience that, yep, I've seen this before, this is good. Those are, things change so rapidly that you have to replace it with study tools. And MISO mentioned their online stability tool, which I know is being used to calculate some of these like MWEX, the Minnesota, Wisconsin export limit. They're using their stability tool to calculate that. So I think the answer is we need better study tools, and like Dick said earlier, more data on the load shapes and what's the generation do, what's the wind going to do. So that'll be key, is getting better study tools into the operator's hands in the future.
Operators need as many tools in the tool chest as they can have, definitely. Does anyone else want to tackle that in integration of modeling for avoiding instability areas?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think today we have the system operators have invested heavily in this area. So the science and the math has made progress where we don't need to statically know in advance all of our stability limits. So thanks to high-speed computing, we can actually run the entire MISO model if you want and look for problems. And we do that. So again, as Todd pointed out, we run those calculations, but I think from a real-time perspective, the capability is already there. So at least I wanted to say it's not all about future things we need. I think some things we have today. We just have to keep monitoring and utilizing those tools.
Great to hear that we're already getting on top of this, Renuka. Thank you for that. Dick, I'm going to direct the next audience question for you, and I would, of course, welcome your colleagues to chime in as well. This is an intriguing one that I confess I hadn't given a lot of thought to, so I appreciate the question. I understand that vehicle-to-grid technology is not a reality today. In parens, it doesn't exist for most EV models. But imagining a future system that takes advantage of the significant storage in an EV, is there a role for that to provide home reliability in a way that helps grid operation? Dick, have you or any of your distribution co-ops given this thought as we delve down into the distribution and how that system can benefit our transmission system?
That's an interesting question, and I think it's in its infancy somewhat. I mean, there's that opportunity for sure as the vehicle technologies advance, and you have these vehicles. You know, you see commercials now where the Ford truck's out in the woods and they plug in and light up their campsite, right? So there's opportunities there, but there's, you know, part of that, there's complexities around it. And it's really around, you know, getting the individuals to, you know, sign on to those programs if you're going to use it for a grid resource, or, you know, it could just be a home resource. So there's certain things that I think are possible with those new technologies. There's, you know, Lloyd mentioned before, they're not really a resource, it's kind of a shift in energy. So if those vehicles are going to be used as that type of resource, you know, they still have to be charged, and they have to be charged in a way that, you know, the grid can support that charging mechanism. But I think there's opportunity there, and it's complex because of all the nodal points and you know, the purchasers. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully someone else can add to it.
Thanks, Dick. Appreciate you responding to that question. Would like to remind the audience we have about 10 minutes left in our panel. If you have any additional questions, please get them in now. I'm going to direct the next question to Lloyd. I'd like to hear from you. One of the conversations that we've heard during this morning's symposium has been listening to the voices, and there's a myriad of voices as we look to the future. But who are the voices that should be heard as we think about reliable operations 24/7, directing at our North Star of reliability?
You know, as was mentioned, you know, in some of the earlier conversations, you know, system operators, you know, we enjoy and live for the margins. And so having system operations not only be involved maybe with the planners, you know, as they're planning the system, but also having some discussions, you know, with the policymakers, similar to what this panel is doing today, you know, where we're having discussions about the nuances of operating the system and what can be done in order to operate it more reliably. We're becoming more and more dependent on the independent system operator, whether it be MISO or SPP, to provide the generator resource and to ensure that the resources are there, that it's leaving the transmission operator, you know, which Dick and Todd and I are with, you know, our only resource tool anymore is load curtailments. We don't really control the generation resources and that. So having us involved in a lot of those other discussions will help us prepare so that we can provide our insight on things. And hopefully we don't get to that situation like in SPP we had in February, where now all of a sudden, there's no more resources to dispatch, and you call upon the transmission operator to exercise the only resource tool left to them when they're in a market, and that is curtailing load. So, having us involved, having us have a word or having input on some of these things, I think will help. Even if it doesn't change things, we'll understand why we're moving in this direction and what is happening, which will also help us think ahead and help us prepare for, tomorrow, next week, next year.
Thanks, Lloyd. The voice of the operator early in the process.
Yeah, Joanne, if I could add just a little bit too, I think there's that educational opportunity, which this is, where, operations really comes to the forefront when bad things happen, right? So we have to be cognizant that most of the time things are operating smoothly. And for some of the policymakers to take the time probably to see what it's like to be, in an operating environment and what it means. I think there's opportunity there for that education. And it's up to us probably as utilities to provide that. So just to add that little caveat.
Very important perspective. Thanks, Dick. I just had another question come in. Thank you for such an engaging audience. This is what it's all about. I'm going to open this up to each of you. I'll start with you, Renuka, but I think this is one that all four of you are going to want to respond to the extent that you have a little bit of a nuance to the start of how Renuka responds. From an operator's perspective, what keeps you up at night? If you could change one thing going forward, what would it be?
Yeah, there have been a lot of nights recently to be up about, so certainly timely question. I'll boil it down to three things, right? So first, we want to be able to see things so we can respond from an operator's perspective. If we can't see, we can't respond. So we have to be able to see. Second is to make sure that we have the tools and training to respond to the event, right? So again, making sure we are prepared to respond is a huge element for the operators as well. And third element is no shaky hands here. We have to actually act. As much as, we know the amount of inquiries and the questions and everything else. Somebody said earlier that we only get asked questions when things don't work as well. We know that happens, but still not hesitating to take the action to protect reliability. So those are the three things that I think I always think about, that I hope we're making sure that we can see things, we have the tools and the training, and that we don't hesitate. Again, by the time it comes to real time, everybody has done their part. We get what we get and we don't throw a fit. We just take the necessary actions.
Thanks, Renuka. Lloyd, what keeps you up at night? Is there anything that you would change now to prepare for the future?
Well, I agree with everything that Renuka has said too. So I'll just touch on maybe a couple of different things, maybe a nuance on one of the things she mentioned is, one of the things that I've been, I'll say, harping on for a decade or more is, and the concern being is something will happen, we'll have an event, we'll have taken some action, and then in the post-mortem, they'll find out that we had some data that if it was manipulated or displayed in a way that it would have been informative or something that a decision could have been made on, we could have done something different. And so we had the data to prevent it, but we didn't have the information at hand to be able to prevent it. So that's been a concern of mine for a long time. Also, in the winter and spring, weather has been a big concern. I mean, traditionally it's been, whether that would be like an ice storm or tornadoes that would take lines down. Like the last week, at the end of last week, there was some storms in the Dakotas and in Montana where that took lines down. So, I mean, that's always been a concern, but now we even have these cold snaps, which brings along a whole different perspective, and the heat issues, that are taking place currently in Texas and California, with a lot of weather across the Southwest being well over 100 degrees. So it's the uncertainty of weather. In the past, it's been something that kept me awake, in the wintertime, in the spring when thunderstorms were coming through, or in the wintertime when there was going to be ice storms. But now it seems to be something that's more prevalent as a possibility throughout the whole year.
Thanks, Lloyd. And Dick, I heard Lloyd bring up the data and just managing the volume of data, and going to jump next to you, Todd, if you have anything to add, and then I'll give our closing remarks and hand things back over to Pretty.
Joanne, my first thought on this is when the system is operating out at the edge, it's stressed, where MISO's low on reserves, or the system's heavily loaded, and there's not that margin for the next contingency, you're going to be shedding load. So the lack of action or the wrong action, and any moves get real magnified when the system's stressed. So I think it's actually worse in the winter just from the customer impact. No one wants the lights to go out when it's 20 below. So I think it sums it up for me, operating the system when we're right out at the edge and very stressed. And then I did want to mention that one tool that MISO has, and I think the load modifying resources, that's a good tool. When the generation runs out, people have registered different resources. MISO called on that last week. It drops the peak down. So that is a tool. That's a market tool and deployed by MISO, but it's good to see that option's out there. So.
Well, I want to thank this panel. I mean, I think we could talk about this all day. Really appreciate your engagement and sharing your wealth of experience. Pretty, a few takeaways that I heard is we're experienced. Our operators are very knowledgeable, well-trained. We're going to see change. We got to stay on top of that change. Visibility is important. Having the right tools, having the right training, taking action, and taking this action in a measured approach. Balancing, flexibility, it's going to take all of us working together to ensure our transmission system is prepared. But my key takeaway is we've got this. Thank you again, panelists. Pretty, I'll turn it over to you next.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne. That was a great wrap up of the panel. Renuka, Lloyd, Todd, Dick, really appreciate all of your great insights today. I want to thank all of you for all the work that you do to give us that 99.995% reliability rate that we have nationally, that very few people celebrate, but so few people know the incredible work that's happening behind the scenes. And it's really important from our perspective to have people understand what are the situations you confront, what are the decisions you have to make within seconds. I really appreciate, as Joanne outlined, your perspectives over what additional forward-looking policies we need to focus on, the infrastructure that we'll need to maintain reliability if we continue to see our fleet transition at the pace and scale that it is. I heard principles that we need to incorporate, like let's not back ourselves up to a ledge. Let's have the voice of the operator be at the forefront of a lot of decisions as well. Thinking of resource adequacy with a focus on delivered energy and sufficiency every hour. That's critically important. And as Renuka alluded to, our definition of reliability is changing. It's no longer about just keeping the lights on 99.99% of the time, but even during extreme events like some of the events we've experienced across the country. So it's not just about reliability, but we're also seeing it's about resiliency. And so that's a great segue to our third panel on planning the grid for resiliency and what resiliency will require as our energy production is shifting more and more toward weather-dependent technologies, especially in the northern region. So we're joined by Mark Mitchell of Southern Minnesota Municipal Power Agency. Mark has spent his 39-year career with public power utilities. He serves as the chair of Grid North Partners. He's currently SMMPA's Director of Operations and Chief Operating Officer. And before joining SMMPA in 2011, he served as the Executive Director of the Arizona Power Authority and served in a variety of positions at Salt River Project. So Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Pretty. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be involved with Grid North Partners. It's as Pretty said, I've had a pretty long career, but it's just been so fulfilling to be a part of an organization like Grid North Partners that is bringing such diverse utilities together to solve the problems that we face. And so already so far, there's been some great discussion, great information shared. We've heard about the ambitious decarbonization goals that we have both nationally and in our region. We've heard about the challenges of getting infrastructure built in a time frame that meets the needs of our changing system. And then just heard from the operators about the challenge of being able to maintain reliability with maybe a different set of tools, maybe even tools that haven't yet been developed. So now let's shift gears and talk about, with that as a backdrop, how do we plan the transmission system or the grid in general, which is more than just wires, but can also be other tools that will have to be brought to bear. So how do we plan that to maintain a resilient grid that can continue to provide the reliability that we've enjoyed to date? We've talked some about the work that CapEx has did in the past, now Grid North Partners, in terms of identifying system needs, challenges that we had, and we developed a system to address those needs at that time. Now we're looking to the future where we have different challenges and different risks. So how do we identify what those solutions are? We obviously know that we need more infrastructure. There's been a lot of discussion about that already, not only to interconnect more geographically diverse resources, but also to be able to move large amounts of energy into and out of the region on a regular basis as we become, as reliability gets defined, as the last panel said, at times more in terms of energy needs rather than capacity needs. And when we talk about planning, you can think of it in terms of long-term, but a lot of the changes that we're talking about are already upon us there. We know that resources are being retired, existing dispatchable resources, more renewables being added. So there are solutions that we need to put in place for the near term to address problems, but also that need to fit with the long term. So how do we identify projects and infrastructure changes that are what we call no regrets solutions, so that meaning that they work now and they fit well with long-term solutions. We have a great slate of panelists to talk about this topic. And what's really interesting about this panel is the diverse perspectives that they bring, not only in terms of the regions that they serve in, but also the customer base that they serve. And I'm going to ask them to share their views on resiliency, what that means to them, how to plan for it, how new and emerging technologies might fit into these longer term solutions, and how do we do all of this in ways that can minimize both the public and environmental impacts. And I'm not going to read the bios of each of these speakers. There's links in the material. for that. But what I will say is just give a little bit of insight into the perspective that they bring to the table. First, we have Dan Gunderson. Dan is the Vice President of Transmission and Distribution at Minnesota Power. And Minnesota Power, what's unique about the perspective they bring is a large portion of their customer base are large industrial customers. And they have a very specific view, interest in reliability and in cost. And so when Dan's thinking about these solutions, he has to think about how that impacts the large industrial customers. Next, we have Ian Benson. Ian is an area vice president for Xcel Energy, and he's responsible for transmission strategy and planning. And the unique perspective that Xcel brings is the fact that they serve over a very wide region. It's not just serving in the upper Midwest, but as was said earlier, they serve in 8 states, including states like Texas that have larger penetration of renewables than we have in our area right now. And so issues and challenges that Xcel has seen in those other regions can inform decisions that we make on planning going forward in our region. Then we have Tim Noldner. Tim is the Vice President of Rates and Special Projects for WPPI Energy in Wisconsin. WPPI is a joint action agency that serves municipal electric utilities. And both WPPI and their members are not-for-profit entities, very cost-conscious. And the unique perspective that they bring is that they're very focused on their local communities. So they bring that local interest and local perspective, but at the same time are interested in the broader regional reliability because they rely on the grid to provide energy. And then lastly, we have Casey Cathy. Casey is the Director of Planning for Southwest Power Pool. And what is unique about his perspective is he has to plan for an entire region. So all of the diversity of our other panelists, and probably even more diverse than that, when Casey's looking at solutions in the SPP region, is he has to consider all of those perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what each of these panelists have to say about planning for our future grid. And I'd like to start with just giving each panelist a couple of minutes to just provide some introductory remarks. Then we'll get into questions. I have some questions to get us rolling, but as with the other panels, if you have questions that you'd like to get to the panelists, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. But first, let's hear some introductory remarks from our panelists. Dan, I'll start with you.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. One of the great things about the panel today is we have been living this grid transition in real time at Minnesota Power. It's been a fascinating journey for us as we have closed 7 smaller coal units and really looked at transitioning to what we need from a transmission perspective to go beyond the 50% renewable rate that we are already at for energy sourcing. For some of you that may not be familiar with Minnesota Power, we start and end our day with our customer, which is our large industrial customer base. It's traditionally iron mining across the Iron Range, as well as a smattering of oil and gas, as well as a legacy paper and wood products industry that has been scattered throughout northeastern Minnesota that we've kind of planned our system around. As we look at serving those customers, they're obviously a very energy intensive businesses that require energy 24/7, which is an ideal fit for traditional baseload generation, which also operates 24/7. So they're a nice match with each other. So one of the interesting and upcoming challenges we have is how do we match renewable resourcing to that? And we developed a great energy strategy for that by leveraging Canadian hydro as well as North Dakota wind, combined with our localized resources to really optimize that energy view as we go forward. So coming with that, though, is obviously some challenges, and critical to that is resiliency of those connections. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that later today, but also want to share, we are also the provider for about 140,000 customers in northeastern Minnesota from a distribution perspective, as well as a lot of those support industries and communities within this area as a municipal power supplier. So all of those things combine to exciting future for us. So I'll turn it back to you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. Ian, how about
you? Hey, Mark. Yes, I'm Ian Benson. I'm the Vice President of Planning for Xcel Energy. I was thinking about earlier on in the day when Aaron posed that question, where was the industry when you started? And I think I started back in the Middle Ages sometime. And back in those days when I started, it was actually about 30 years ago. We did transmission planning. We planned for the peak day, the peak summer day, the hot, humid day where the electrical loads were high and everyone had their air conditioning on. Those days are long gone. It's now an 8760 system, and problems can happen at any time, and we have to plan for that. So, Mark, as you mentioned, I do work for Xcel Energy. We are an 8-state utility, but behind that, we actually have 3 different transmission systems. Obviously, the one here on the north, the NSP system that we work with the Grid North partners and with MISO. We're also the largest utility in Colorado, and we serve Denver and the Front Range and electrical customers up in the mountains as well. And we do have a Texas and New Mexico utility that's outside of ERCOT. And that gives us an advantage that it's the same electricity, it's the same physics, but we learn different things on our different systems and we experience it. So we bring that to bear as we change all of our systems and we work on resilience. And when I think about resilience, there's 2 things that come to the forefront for me. One is everyone is taking carbon off their systems. And we talked about that earlier in the day as well. And we're all doing it primarily in the same way. We're putting wind and solar on, and to a certain extent, we're putting it onto our distribution systems as well. So these are weather-dependent generation sources. And for example, here at Xcel Energy, we have 10,000 megawatts of wind connected to our systems. And for those that perhaps aren't well-versed in the sizes of megawatts, 500 megawatts is about the size of a big traditional baseload unit, a coal unit or a nuclear power unit. So 10,000 megawatts is a lot of wind. So we do have some operating experience, but it's not all on the transmission system. Here on the NSP system, we have over 400 distributed solar facilities, and that represents about 800 megawatts. It's a significant generation that's happening on our distribution system, not just on our transmission system. And so those days of old where transmission and distribution were quite different, they're merging together, and it's becoming one grid, and that's how we're approaching it. So the second thing I think about in terms of resilience is the weather. Obviously weather-dependent generation, but the weather itself is actually changing and it's getting more intense. And this isn't theoretical. We're actually seeing this, and there's so many examples in the last couple of years. If you're on the Gulf Coast or on the Eastern Seaboard, it's the intensity and the frequency of the hurricanes. If you're in the West, on the West Coast, or like our Colorado system, it's the drought-induced wildfires that we're seeing. Here on the North, we've seen polar vortex a couple of years ago, and that took the temperatures down to minus 30 to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Some things don't work so well at that kind of temperature. We're all familiar with what happened earlier this year in Texas, and that was a deep freeze. Yeah, it was down to 0 degrees, and if you're a northerner, it's not that cold, but for Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, it was really cold, and it had some severe impacts. But we've also seen some other things, like on our Colorado system. We've seen something that's actually a meteorological event called a bomb cyclone. It's rare. I'm not making the term up. It's a drop in barometric pressure, a massive drop in 24 hours. And that leads to all kinds of storms. And what it means for us is we lose our wind. So these are the kinds of things that are happening. And these are the kind of things we have to address with resilience. So I'm looking forward to the panel. I think it's a great topic. And I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. Thanks for those remarks. All right, Tim, if you'd like to give us some introductory remarks from WPPI's perspective.
Certainly. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And
I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel. I have great respect for my fellow panelists, and I've enjoyed all of the panels and its discussion up to this point today. I'm an electrical engineer by training, and I've worked in this amazing industry now for a little over 35 years. I lead WPPI's participation in Grid North Partners. Thought I'd describe a little bit about WPPI since we're not located in Minnesota, and I think most of our audience is in Minnesota. Like Mark said, we're a municipal joint action agency. We serve 51 not-for-profit municipal utilities located in Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We sell wholesale power to our members, and then they in turn distribute it to their customers. WPPI owns generators and a portion of the transmission system. We have quite a few contracts that are long-term, both with conventional resources and renewable resources. Our resources include significant portions of nuclear, coal-fired, gas-fired, wind, and pretty soon here, 100 megawatt solar array. We have a peak demand of about 1,000 megawatts, and our mission from a power supply standpoint is to provide our members with reliable, affordable, and responsible power supply. We look forward to working together with our Grid North partners and with you, the audience, other stakeholders, to meet the challenge of providing a reliable grid at an affordable price and to enable the transformation to a low carbon economy in the future here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And finally, Casey, would you like to give us an SPP perspective for intro?
Okay. Hey, Mark, can you hear me well enough? Okay. I'll try to be brief. I didn't know if you wanted to give an update or a briefing first, and then we hit the resilience questions later. So Southwest Power Pool is a RTO, similar to MISO. We cover all or parts of 14 states. I'm happy to be here. I think that this panel and really this overall Finding True North session this morning hits on most all topics that SPP has on our plate, and I think the industry as a whole, even internationally. Something that I thought about when I was trying to find my major years ago was I wanted to go into engineering primarily to work with smart people to solve challenging problems. And I think that I found the industry. So we definitely have our work cut out for us. Something, if you've tracked SPP over time, we started our full energy markets after MISO, after PJM. We expanded our footprint a little bit after PJM and MISO had been established. And, back even 10, 15 years ago, the easy thing to do when we had a challenge was to say, well, how does ERCOT do it? How does California ISO do it? How does PJM or MISO do it? Now we're finding that we're all in the same bucket. Yes, California has a lot of solar, SPP has a lot of wind. I mean, everyone has unique situations, but we're finding ourselves in a mode where you can learn from others, but really the entire industry is learning as a whole. I think Aaron Bloom earlier mentioned around macro grid and just the nature of networking. I think that's very key to what we're talking about on this panel and really what needs to happen moving forward. Mark, I want to keep this brief because I think there's a number of things that SPP is involved in, but we probably flesh that out through the panel. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Casey. I appreciate all of those opening remarks. The first couple of questions that I have are going to be for all of the panelists, and then I'll zero in on some of you individually and certainly give others the opportunity to chime in. But this first question is two parts, and it's how would you define resiliency in the context of the power system, and what is changing in the grid that's impacting reliability and resiliency? And Dan, I'll start with you.
All right, thanks for the question, Mark. One of the challenges that we have, particularly in the upper Midwest, is the fact that, the ambient temperature here fluctuates just shy of 150 degrees. So it's kind of unique. It's kind of unique when you think about it from a engineering perspective, because there's not many places that have that type of challenge to begin with. Some people have higher temps, some people have lower overall temps, but we're kind of in a nice sweet spot from that ambient temperature range where we plan for both winter and summer. And when I think of resiliency from a planning perspective, we really need to build robust enough to withstand just that as a normal element. And then beyond that, all of the storms and other weather events that get thrown our way, whether it be icing and or high wind events that enter our system. So we've traditionally taken a planning approach to resiliency of having, multiple contingency failures before we have any impact to our end use customers with regard to the transmission system. And, I think that leads very well into the things that are changing. We've historically relied on a lot of smaller units, particularly in small transmission, to provide some of those resiliency aspects. And particularly if we can underload some lines or manage flexibility around specific generation units, it makes it a little bit easier to not push those lines to the limit, or gives you a little bit more flexible options to do so. So that's one of the big challenges as we transition, and particularly transition to intermittent resources, is it's going to require many more of those resources connected to transmission resources connected to generation that can be reliable, and we need a lot more of that generation as well. So you're going to see, and one of the things that's required for the build out is far more renewables. Essentially from the perspective of renewable build as a whole, from a national standpoint, it's going to be 2 to 3 times the amount of renewables as in terms of the base load that we have now, as well as transmission interconnecting that. And as Aaron showed earlier, a lot of interregional interconnection as well that's going to be needed for that source. So as we've hit on all of that today, the resiliency it's starting more on the local level and broadening out far more. And the other thing that's needed is a lot more local interaction. And we were one of the things that we've done is we've transitioned our small coal unit as we have our first static VAR compensator unit that is conveniently placed where everybody would like to live on the North Shore of Lake Superior, to help with balancing some of our customers up there. So a really unique asset in our first experience of going down that road. But that's another example of where you need kind of specific apparatus to replace what some of those small units had. So I think you're going to see a trend of that as well, but that's going to be smaller and then getting into the bigger and bigger solutions as we work out towards the resource issue. So I think that's how I would summarize those two questions.
Okay, thank you. Ian, I know you touched a little bit on your perspective on resiliency, but would you like to expound on that a little bit?
Sure can, Mark. First of all, I agree with everything Dan was saying. When I think about resilience, it's an emerging term in our industry because of what's happening, because of the changes of the generation, because of the changes in the storms and the weather conditions. But we've done something for decades, and that's reliability. And so, if anything, resilience is the child of reliability. And what we've done for reliability, we look more local. We look at, can the system handle that transmission line coming offline, or that generator tripping, or that substation bus fault, and can the system handle it in any kind of contingency that we've got? But it tends to be local, and that's the heart of the reliability requirements that we plan our systems to for NERC. So resilience is emerging, and I think back to something that Aaron said earlier on today. It's about not going alone. It's not Xcel Energy taking care of Xcel Energy system when it comes to resilience, because the storms, as he had that storm crossing America. It's a great example of that. And it's not just relying on your neighbor. Obviously, the Grid North partners have worked together even before the CapEx days. So we have a long history of collaborative work, but it's actually your neighbor's neighbor. And by that, I mean, not just the next state over, perhaps the next region over. And we talk about resilience in terms of storms and bad things that are happening, but there's also the flip side to that is when things are going really well. When it's a beautiful sunny day and there's 15-knot winds and all of the wind generation is producing and all of the solar generation is producing, there is carbon-free energy that needs to get to customers and to loads. So that's part of the equation too, about moving those resources, that power to those that need it as well. So kind of a long answer. And obviously what's changing with respect to the grid and resiliency is the nature of the grids, the generation's changing, the weather's changing, and we're seeing things that are impacting our customers all across America. So this is an emerging issue, but not a new issue at the same time. I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ethan. Tim, what does resiliency mean to WPPI and its members?
Sure. I think both Ian and Dan gave pretty good definitions. When I think of resiliency, I think of having the right infrastructure in place so that smart people with good information and a good plan can keep the grid serving customers 7/24. And by infrastructure, I mean not just the transmission infrastructure, but the generation, storage resources, load flexibility, all those tools that we can use to maintain reliability. When it comes to what's changed on the grid, I won't reiterate very in much depth what others have said yet, but the first thing on my list was weather-dependent generation. In the past, the load was the variable and the generation was pretty solid unless you had a forced outage or a D-rate. Now both the supply and the load are moving all the time. So it's a lot more of a challenge to line those up. The amount of electricity that the resources we're producing in a given hour is a lot less certain. I thought it might be interesting for people just to take a look back at last week and on our system, what we saw. We have about 290 megawatts of wind generation. And we diversified it by having 5 different wind farms in 3 different states. There's 2 in Wisconsin, 2 in Iowa, and 1 in Illinois. And going into the hot week on the weekend, we were getting pretty good wind production. That 290 megawatts worth of nameplate capacity was producing 125 megawatts at the peak hour on Saturday, 154 on Sunday, and then it declined from there as the weather got even hotter. The peak hour of the week, which happened on Thursday, we were getting 9 megawatts out of the 290. And if you took just the hottest hours where our load was 850 or higher, it averaged 17 megawatts. So in the old days, that would have been really hard for WPPI to manage, but fortunately we have an RTO, we have MISO, and MISO is able to draw on the diversity over a much bigger region, and we don't have to worry as much about lining up our own load and our own resources anymore. Another factor that's different, I think, and both Boyd and Aaron, I believe, talked about this, and that's that the amount of storage on the system has really gone down, and I don't mean electric storage, I mean fuel storage. So as the baseload coal plants in particular retire, a lot of those plants used to maintain a 90-day to 120-day burn of coal on the ground. So if transportation got interrupted, they could continue to generate for months. That's going away. And a lot more of the units now are depending on natural gas deliveries over a pipeline for the variable renewables. So we've got to replace that in some form, either electric storage or take advantage of hydro and more transmission to be able to reach farther out and capture that diversity from further away. And then I did hear one other thing this morning, which was the loss of rotating machine inertia and the effect that has on stability. But there's tools to offset that and correct that issue.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. All right, Casey, SPP's perspective on resiliency and changes in the grid that are challenging that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So resiliency to me, just in a, I guess a dictionary term, it would be the ability or measurement to maintain reliability through an event or recover from an event. And so, you know, for SPP, and it's been mentioned, we've seen different weather events. Just recently in February, we saw the cold week that we had. We've seen ice storms, we've seen tornadoes, just depending on what footprint you might be looking at. There's certainly things that I would equate to some level of resilience. In particular, what happened in February, we lost a lot of gas generation. And so one thing that I would say is just like your investment portfolio, and I'm not a finance guy, but one of the main, I guess, mantras of investing is to diversify your portfolio. You don't want to put all your money in one particular investment. It's probably not wise. It's the same thing for SPP. I think that in our industry, there's all different types of attributes for all different types of generation. And even now load is being very interesting as opposed to just traditional load decades ago. And so you look at all of those particular assets, and I think from a resiliency measurement perspective, it's all about diversifying that and making sure that you can reasonably maintain reliability through such events. And that really comes down to some of the things that we've talked about earlier in this session around, it comes down to investment. No one wants to pay 5 times their current monthly bill in electricity. And so it's this balance between maintaining reliability, making sure that we're covering the edge cases. It's been said, 1 in 10 is kind of the 1 day in 10 years for reliability and ensuring capacity. Well, sometimes that happens a little bit more often, multiple days in 10 years. And it comes down to what level of investment, what type of appetite do we have? And I think that the industry as a whole is becoming so complex. It's not a matter of, we have a certain amount of load growth, let's add a peaker unit. That might have been the case in the 80s or 90s, but now it's very complex because we're experiencing this massive regional fuel mix change. At the same time, we're experiencing all different types of new and exciting technologies to be able to leverage, let's say, aggregated distributed energy resources or EVs. But that leads to itself a certain level of uncertainty. And I think that that's a big piece in key in resiliency is we need to somehow come up with different ways to measure that uncertainty and try to plan for it such that we can maintain or increase our resiliency. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Casey. Casey, I'm going to stay with you. I've got a question from the audience. And it says, how can interregional coordination lead to a better grid? And what current initiatives is SPP involved in with your neighbors?
Okay. Great question. So we have an interregional relations process with MISO. It's fairly robust, and we've gone through what we call coordinated system plans. We've gone through 3 of them, and we've yet to identify a particular project, and it's for various reasons. MISO has their particular tariff and cost allocation rules. SP has their particular tariff and cost allocation rules, and we just haven't gotten something through the finish line. Currently, we are working on a study this year that's supposed to conclude at the end of this year. And what it does is try to optimize generation interconnection those generation interconnection customers that are along the seam within MISO and SPP. And what we're attempting to do is simulate what MISO would normally do in the, excuse me, someone's calling. What we're attempting to do is simulate what MISO would do in their generation interconnection process, as well as SPP simulating the same process. And then we try to optimize the solutions along the seam. That's not traditionally how it's done. How it's usually done is each individual region, and then we just do an affected system study to make sure that there's no harm on the other side. So this is kind of a novel type of approach we're doing with MISO. And if it is successful, it might lead to projects that would be more optimal than piecemeal projects to allow certain wind farms, let's say in Iowa, to connect to MISO, and then we eventually lead to some economic interregional project. We're also working with Sask Power, Saskatchewan in the north for additional interregional relations or interregional projects. And SPP is also, we are expanding to the Western interconnection. And with that will come some very interesting possible seams projects that somewhat, it's not the master plan that Aaron provided, but there is some level of that. Once SPP jumps the DC ties to the Western interconnection, there is a ample opportunity under a single tariff to begin some additional transmission facilities to help, let's say, Colorado meet their needs while also exercising maybe Nebraska or South Dakota to be able to expand on that eventual reliability and resiliency based on renewable portfolios or profiles.
Excellent. Thank you. Ian, you mentioned that planning needs to be, instead of just a peak day planning, now it's more of an 8760 planning process and focused on resiliency. So how do we measure and demonstrate that an investment increases resiliency and creates value? This is a question from the audience.
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes back to a little bit of what Aaron was talking about earlier, and that's about how power can move around. And I'll back up from what Aaron was saying and saying if we go alone, if Xcel Energy goes alone on transmission and generation, it's going to be really, really expensive. If our backup is ourselves and the backup to the N-1 or N-2 contingencies are all within one utility, it gets really expensive. And when we superimpose a resilience issue or weather event, like I mentioned earlier, it's impacting our neighbors as well. So that's not necessarily where the help comes from. So from that perspective, relying on the neighbors and the neighbors of the neighbors, which really means across the country, that's where the benefit of ensuring the reliability of the power system. But I think behind that is something even more important. So from a transmission perspective, transmission creates options. And if we're going to decarbonize the country, we have to have the options that come with the transmission. And in our industry, there is no little money. Everything is expensive. Energy is expensive. A megawatt hour is expensive. And transmission is expensive. Generation is really expensive. So it's getting that right. Does transmission enable cheaper energy for more people? And that's what we need to do with our system planning. And as Casey was pointing out, our interregional planning, can we open up those doors? I think that's a really important part of going forward. There's more benefit than there is cost. And getting it assigned in the right place can avoid curtailments. It can get the carbon-free energy to those that need it, that maybe don't have it out their back door. We're fortunate and the Grid North partners and all the way up and down Middle America that we have some great access to renewable resources. It needs to get farther away from our immediate systems. So kind of a long-winded answer to your question, Mark, but it's a really good question.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. Tim, we've talked about transmission, about broad transmission across regions and a role that SPP might play in facilitating some of that. But what about non-wires solutions or enhancements to the grid, or tools that could be brought to bear here. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, there are definitely ways to help manage the amount of transmission that's needed by using non-wires alternatives. And by that, I mean things like distributed generation. You know, if you can site some generation close to load, like rooftop solar, it reduces, at least at times, the amount of power that needs to flow across the transmission system. You still need to think and remember that there's going to be times when that rooftop unit is not going to be producing anything, and you're going to have to serve the customer. So you have to be able to back it up. Yeah. That it'll reduce the amount that you need to build. I think it was Aaron that mentioned, or maybe someone else, that some of these distributed generation resources could possibly reduce utility load by about 16%. I think was the number that came to mind. I think a lot of that could be eaten up by other technologies like EVs that might actually charge on the local distribution system, but at least it would minimize the amount of transmission that needs to be built for new load serving. I think most of the transmission that will be built is more to replace generation than serving new load. Let's see, other non-wires alternatives. Storage is a big one. Who knows how quickly that will develop in an affordable manner. You know, for me, this isn't necessarily a non-wires alternative, but I would look first to the storage that is already proven in our region. It's a natural advantage, which is Manitoba Hydro, the biggest battery in MISO, and making sure that we can fully use in collaboration with them the capability they have to pull in energy when our intermittent resources are producing extra and send it out when we're short. They have tremendous capability, and that's already in place. We need wires to get there, but not as much as if we have to reach further with that.
Okay, good. Thanks, Tim. I want to open this up to the others. I mean, Tim talked about some of these non-wire solutions. This is for any of you who want to jump in, how do we factor those non-wires tools into the planning process? Casey.
Yeah, so this SPP runs an annual integrated transmission plan process, and part of FERC Order 1000, we adhere to some competitive transmission projects. In the last few cycles, the last few studies, we've received some batteries, so non-wire solutions for the needs. They were ultimately costed out, but not as much as you would think. So as costs come down, I do suspect that we may see some batteries actually be selected as solutions for SPP. So in general, for at least SPP's process, when we post the transmission needs on our annual cycle, the members can submit non-wire solutions, and it is pretty interesting because we've actually received some other nuanced non-wire solutions. Ultimately, again, costed out, but it's kind of telling a little bit of a tale that we need to think differently and start assessing these things a little bit more than what has been traditional transmission solutions.
Thanks, Casey. Dan, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, you know, as you look at some of the non-wires solutions, I think customer side solutions are going to be a big part of the future too. I talked about our big industrial load base, but what that helps us with is about 20% of our total system load winds up being interruptible, just shy of that. But it's an incredible amount to call on. The problem is the incentive structure has to be there. And, you know, if you increase volatility a lot, customers do not want to interrupt, especially people that are producing products of high value at a time when they're at an upcycle. Those aren't the best times to ask customers to interrupt, particularly that are making material. So there's economic challenges there. One other thing I want to hit on with the non-wires alternative, Ian brought up a really good point earlier, and I want to reiterate it because I think it's an awesome takeaway. We are really figuring out how to optimally move energy from where it can be optimally generated to where it's used in a renewable world. And that is it's a different challenge and a different way to view, the current grid assets. And I don't think it's an alternative, but an and. We need a lot of other storage resources, and whether that be customer sited through other electrification, you look at pump hydro, things like that, that are very large scale to move energy closer to where it might be used and stored in a way that can be used over a longer period of time. That's an and to the transmission. So I wouldn't view it as an alternative, but an addition, because that's really what you're going to need to facilitate lower and lower carbon.
Yeah, great point, Dan. And I think I probably did talk about it in terms of an or, but you're absolutely right. It's going to take everything that we can think of to be able to put together a resilient system. Casey, I want to come back to you for a minute, because you manage the process of annual transmission planning. We're all involved in it in the MISO region in particular, but as we go through the planning process, a lot of different projects come forward. There's a lot of ideas and a lot of projects come forward. So how do we pick the right projects that solve both the near term and long term issues, and without overbuilding? And as part of that, how do we think through how to minimize the impacts on the public and the environment as we develop that system?
Yeah, great question. So without getting into all of the technical details on how we develop a transmission portfolio, I think that one thing that SPP is doing is we run sensitivities. And so you run sensitivities and you run benefits metrics, and SPP does that on the back end after we've developed a final portfolio. And it's just like any other business decision, or even your own personal decision when you are thinking about expanding your house or whatever. You kind of go through how long you're going to live there, and what are the outcomes, or what if I lose my job, or those kind of types of questions that you would ask yourself. And SPP does the same thing on the final portfolio. We run gas price sensitivities and say, okay, well, this is what the gas forecast says in 5 years and 10 years out. But in order to maintain the integrity of the financial analysis of the final portfolio, since the SPP's members, I mean, everyone wants zero risk, but there's never zero risk when you're thinking about the future. What we're trying to do is pull in some of those sensitivities and the benefits metrics into the development of the transmission portfolio. And it might seem simple and say, well, you just do that. But it's a matrix of problems. It's, we look already at multiple futures. We look at multiple needs. We try to mesh all of the generation and transmission needs and load needs such that we are meeting public policy operational needs that we've seen in real time, reliability needs, and as well as economic needs. And we try to optimize all of those at the same time. So even if you pull in, let's say, a gas sensitivity in the development of the portfolio, it gets very complicated very fast. But that is something that we're looking into in the future because of how uncertain our industry is and all of the various changes. In order to maintain that integrity of the financial investment, transmission is a good idea. But to your point, Mark, you could easily build a line, a 100-mile line, and say this makes sense. And then in 5 years' time, the load changes, the generation changes. All of a sudden, that line doesn't even get a whole lot of flow on it. So we absolutely need to make sure that we're doing our diligence in that development.
Thanks. Any of the other panelists want to add to that?
Yeah, Mark, this is Ian. I'll just add, I think that was a great summary by Casey. Part of the transmission planning is not just the models or the assumptions and the sensitivities and the scenarios that are looked at. When you get the future right, then you know what to do with the transmission system. But it's also part of the stakeholder process. It has to be open and transparent. We're all stakeholders. It's such an important part of our economy to get this right. So whether it's with our regulators that are involved, our customers, our industrial customers, it takes all of us to get that right and make sure the right transmission's built. And then go through the process of the need processes in the various states and locations. And again, prove that that's the right transmission that needs to be built.
Yeah.
So just adding on to some of Casey's comments.
Yeah, great point. Tim, you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I wanted to comment on the part of the question about minimizing the public and environmental impacts of the infrastructure expansion. I think through collaboration that we can develop as close to the right plan as possible. When you're looking at a big project, the time when you have the most influence over total cost is in developing the right plan. Everything after that is relatively minor. I mean, bidding it right, executing right, all matter, but they're not as big as having the right plan. And the more participation we have in collaboration in developing the plan, the better it will be. Another thought I have is invest a little extra on the front end to get some flexibility. And I'm thinking back to the Group 1 projects. One thing that I thought was great foresight on the part of the utilities and the commission was to build those lines with double circuit capable towers and string one side, and that leaves the other side available to basically add a second line on the same right of way. And so I drove up to North Dakota a couple weekends ago, and it's already strung the second circuit across the interstate, so you don't even have to disrupt traffic to add that second circuit. That was a relatively minor incremental cost, but it adds a lot of flexibility. You don't have to get through right away. And then one other area is I think we should always keep in mind what unique benefits or strengths our region has. And a couple of examples, as opposed to other parts of the country, we have DC expertise among our utilities. Not at WPPI, but Minnesota Power and Great River Energy, Manitoba Hydro, they operate and have operated DC transmission for many years. By putting more DC transmission out there, you can actually control the flow on that as opposed to AC system, and you can squeeze a little bit more capability out of the underlying AC by how you operate the DC. So those are a couple of other items that I think would help minimize the impact.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Good comments. I see we are at the 1 minute mark till our time is up. So I have some other questions I wanted to go through, but we're out of time. Does anybody have any closing remarks you'd like to add before we wrap this up? Dan?
Maybe just to touch on Tim's and wrapping up that last point as well. I think, as we're looking at this transmission in a whole with all of these entities, it's really 3 levels of transmission. We're going to have local transition among all of our utilities, and that's something we're used to planning for. And then we have this Grid North level, which is regional. And part of that we have a large HVDC to help move things around and some experience that way. And that's part of I think something we should really think seriously about. And then what we heard from Aaron this morning is we have this really large interregional need. We've had these situations where, we unfortunately we have had, generation limits over a huge swath of the country, but there's others that can help and produce. So there's kind of these 3 levels to think about as we're going forward. And I think that we need to be definitely working on all those levels. But I think right now the Grid North group in particular is really focused on the right things in the right area.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, as I think about Aaron's opening remarks and then thinking about what Casey said about the work that's being done between their regional partners in their planning process, we have Grid North partners focusing on all of the right things, but looking to the future, maybe it needs to be a Grid US partners at some point, because that broader interregional planning is going to be really important. I want to just say thank you very much to all of the panelists. I really appreciate your insight and the perspectives that you bring, and we definitely have challenges ahead of us that I think we're all willing to roll up our sleeves and figure out how to address. So with that, Pretty, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And I want to thank the entire panel for such an incredible discussion. I appreciate the strategic perspectives that this panel gave, that given the needs of the fleet that's changing before us, that it may not be really sufficient to really plan to reliability standards, but our need to be able to plan beyond them, and that would require an additional investment in the system. Nearly all of you articulated that we really need to think about our dependency on transmission multiple states or regions away from us, and that this is becoming bigger than any state or any region going forward, and seriously considering HVDC that we have some experience in. I think Tim's comments about some of the elements of resiliency that may need to consider distributed generation in the future. Dan said, possibly, more locally sited storage capabilities to really facilitate the change that will go under with our generation fleet. And of course, we know that the promise of new technology gives us a number of options, but given the accelerating pace of change and our need to maintain reliability, we can't gamble our entire future hoping a new technology comes along. So, the way we plan, making sure we're balancing least regrets infrastructure investments with that future optionality, as Tim said, maybe there may be an ability to build out more on the front end to give us some flexibility on the back end. So it was a great panel, really appreciate all of the perspectives. And that does bring us to the end of our day and our symposium. I really want to thank Aaron Bloom, our moderators, and all of our panelists for graciously giving their time and expertise to have this well-needed dialogue. Like Claire Moeller of MISO has repeatedly said in the past, reliability is a team sport. And I think the common theme that you heard from all of the panelists today is that to get through what we're going through with generation changes, it will require all of us to work together. And as we also heard our speakers say, it will require changes in policy, new infrastructure, and evolving how we plan and operate the system. So there is urgency to our work. We need to develop the right transmission plans and make sure that we can execute them on time. Our customers, reliable electric service is table stakes for our customers. So it's an all hands on deck effort to make sure that we're ready for tomorrow's energy future, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that we can deliver it. Grid North Partners is really committed to working with MISO, SPP, the state, stakeholders, the public, utilizing our knowledge of our systems and making sure that we can bring the needed transmission plans to fruition. So if you'd like to get more involved, please reach out to info@gridnorthpartners.com. And on behalf of all of us at Grid North Partners, thank you for your time and attention today, and enjoy the rest of your day.